You are not sitting in a classroom. You are lying flat on the deck of a canoe, your back pressed against warm, salt-worn wood. Above you stretches the open sky, cloudless now, but heavy with memory. You are surrounded by nothing but the sea, yet you are not lost. You are precisely where you need to be because you've learned how to whisper to the stars. This story doesn't begin with a map. It begins with a silence, practiced and intentional, at the edge of the world. A world without compasses. The Polynesians, long before any compass needle danced in Europe, had already crossed a third of the planet. They navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but mental maps, star patterns, cloud forms, and the memory of wave rhythms that pulsed across the Pacific like heartbeats of invisible islands. It is important to understand that to the Western mind, shaped by paper maps and written coordinates, this kind of travel feels like magic. But to the Polynesians, it was simply practice, long, deliberate, often boring practice. They knew that stars did not rise randomly. Each star emerged from the horizon at a fixed location, as if on an invisible grid. A master navigator could lie on his back and watch the stars climb from the sea's edge, memorizing the angle of ascent and tracking the precise place on the horizon where it rose and where it would fall. To call it celestial navigation is not wrong, but it misses the human truth. It was lived astronomy. And unlike European sailors who relied on sextants and charts, Polynesian navigators carried their instruments in their minds. The star compass. The most famous of these mental instruments is the star compass. Not a physical tool, but an oral tradition, a ring of the horizon divided into rising and setting points for major stars. Each star line, or ki alohi, would indicate a direction, where it rose and where it sank, like the tick marks on a clock face. Nainoa Thompson, a Hawaiian navigator trained by Master Maupiailug, once described how the compass wasn't just about stars but was a multisensory grid. It included wind directions, swell patterns, bird flight paths, and even the temperature of the water. But stars were the spine of it all. Each night, a navigator would mentally rotate the sky as the Earth moved. Stars that rose at your stern the night before would be off your port side tonight. You had to remember that, not once, but always. There was no room for error. A miscalculation of 1 degree over a 2,000-mile voyage could land you 35 miles off course, enough to miss an island entirely. In a sea with no rescue, that was a death sentence. Survival required boring precision. How they learned. You might imagine a school with blackboards and long lectures, but Polynesian navigators were trained differently. They learned by watching, by listening, and by sailing. Young apprentices spent entire nights awake on the canoe deck, forbidden to sleep, simply observing how the stars moved. They watched how clouds formed over islands at dawn. They memorized the swell rhythms that bounced off unseen land and returned in patterns you could feel in your bones. They learned to spot frigate birds flying out to sea at dawn and returning at dusk, tracing invisible arcs that pointed toward islands. They learned that different ocean swells, some as subtle as a breath, could intersect at odd angles, revealing nearby land long before sight confirmed it. And they learned through repetition, decades of it. The geometry of trust. The secret wasn't that Polynesians had some supernatural ability. The secret was trust in the patterns. Every detail of the natural world told a story. You just had to be patient enough to hear it. Stars told you direction. Yes, but only if you knew when they would rise. Wind told you speed, but only if you had memorized how your sails behaved under different pressures. Birds hinted at land, but you had to know which ones nested only on shore and which wandered far. Polynesian navigation was geometry laid over the sea, not written with ink but encoded in motion. The ocean wasn't empty. It was full of signs, paths, memories. The void between islands. If you look at a map of Polynesia, you'll see a scattering of dots across an impossibly vast ocean. The distances are staggering. From Hawaii to Tahiti is over 2,600 miles. From Easter Island to New Zealand, over 4,000. And yet, for hundreds of years, voyagers moved between these islands without metal, maps, or sextants. They used the stars, but more than that, they used the spaces between the stars. One method was to steer toward a star path, say, a bright star that rises due east, but the key was to remember its setting point too. The journey was bracketed by celestial geometry: rise point, zenith, set point. You could even travel along the shadow of a star's trajectory, adjusting course slowly as it climbed higher. But on cloudy nights, stars disappeared. That's when the sea spoke. When the stars were gone. Starless nights tested a navigator's skill most. Here, they relied on the swell memory, a system of identifying ocean swell directions and patterns that reflected off nearby land masses. These could travel hundreds of miles, bouncing from island to island. Even in pitch darkness, lying face down, a navigator could sense subtle shifts in motion. A second swell line crossing the first, or a rhythm change that meant land was distorting the water's flow. It sounds mystical. It was. It was pattern recognition. They didn't think of it as mysticism. They thought of it as practice, as dull as watching the same star rise every night for 10 years. But it saved lives. Memory as technology. In the absence of writing, Polynesians passed down these techniques orally. Chants, stories, and genealogies encoded practical information. A song about a fish might reveal the migration path of birds. A myth about a goddess might encode the best season for sailing west. Even the names of stars carried knowledge. Some referred to their navigational function, the one that rises when you must turn north, for example. Others were linked to seasonal changes or to warnings of cyclones. Star charts weren't inked on parchment. They were whispered between generations. Apprentices memorized not just stars but entire voyages. You will sail toward this star for 3 nights, then the wind will shift, then the sea will change, then you will see birds. A voyage could be thousands of miles, and every day was already memorized. Why it was forgotten? As Western explorers arrived and imposed their systems, maps, compasses, written language, the oral systems of navigation were dismissed as primitive or unreliable. They were forgotten not because they failed, but because they were ignored. By the late 19th century, fewer and fewer wayfinders remained. The practice became ritual more than functional. The geometry of the sea faded from memory. But it didn't die. In the 1970s, Polynesian communities began to reclaim their seafaring traditions. They built traditional canoes again. They crossed oceans without instruments. They found islands just as their ancestors had done. And the world finally began to listen. As you lie there on the canoe, the sky above you unrolls like a scroll. A star small, barely visible, rises at the horizon. Is it the right one? Is this the path? You remember the voice of your teacher: trust the sea, it does not lie. But what happens when even the sea grows silent? You are still at sea. The stars have vanished behind a low veil of clouds and the swell has changed direction slightly. You press your hands flat against the canoe deck. Beneath the surface, you can feel something: not a sound, not quite a motion. A shimmer, a flicker, a lapa. You were told about this long ago, though few believed it. It isn't a star or a cloud or a bird. It's a light that flashes just beneath the surface, pointing toward land. And if you miss it, the island may pass like a dream in the night. Tilapa, the lightning that lives in water. Among the lesser-known techniques of Polynesian navigation lies one of the strangest and most contested. Tilapa, often translated as the lightning that points to land. It is not metaphorical lightning. It's a real visual phenomenon, a pulse of light that travels through the ocean, seen just below the surface, and always, according to those who know how to use it, in a direct line from the observer to land. while the academic world has long debated its reality, dismissing it as folklore, illusion, or trickery. Traditional navigators across parts of Micronesia and Polynesia insisted that Lapa was as real and useful as any star. It only appears under very specific conditions. No moon, clouded skies, clear water, absolute stillness of the body, and perhaps something more, a way of seeing that comes not from looking harder but softer. What does Lapa look like? Descriptions vary, but those who claim to have seen it describe a faint, rapid pulse, a line of light darting forward beneath the water, always in a perfectly straight line. It may be mistaken for a fish at first or bioluminescence, but it's not alive. It's directional, it points. Navigators from Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, and parts of the Marquesas described watching these flashes and following them with complete confidence despite having no land in sight. In modern times, researchers like Dr. Marion George have documented oral testimonies from elders who use Lapa regularly. One navigator explained that he would lie completely still, eyes just above the waterline, and wait. If the sea had a story to tell, this was its whisper. Scientific theories and cultural certainty. Scientists who have investigated Lapa have proposed a few possible explanations. One idea is that light from land reflected from waves, cloud edges, or phosphorescent shorelines might refract underwater and travel great distances. Another theory involves electromagnetic pulses or ionospheric reflection, though evidence remains inconclusive. Yet others suggest it may be a mix of biological and optical phenomena, phosphorescent organisms, responding to land-based stimuli or ocean current changes. But to the navigators, none of this mattered. They didn't need an explanation. They had confirmation. Generations of successful landfalls proved it. In traditional navigation, repeated success was the only metric that mattered. If the canoe arrived at land, the technique was valid. Learning to see what others miss. To master Lapa, you don't look harder, you unfocus. This concept recurs in many traditional skills, from animal tracking to night fishing. The observer learns not to impose attention, but to allow attention to widen. The eye in this state is passive. You aren't hunting the signal, you're waiting for it to find you. This discipline requires a kind of mental quiet. To truly see Lapa, you must be completely still, not just your body, but your thoughts. Some navigators said they would spend entire nights waiting for the flash. If it didn't come, they didn't panic. They simply used another technique. But when it did come, they trusted it above all else. The triangle of trust: stars, swells, and Lapa. Polynesian navigation did not depend on any single method. It relied on a network of signs, each reinforcing the others. If the stars told you one direction, the swells another, and Lapa a third, you didn't panic. You looked for consensus. Navigators would often balance these inputs over time, giving more weight to the most consistent signs. For example, the stars might be obscured for days. The swell might shift unexpectedly, but Lapa, it would only appear near land. If it came once, it might be dismissed. If it came again in the same direction, you adjusted your course. In this way, navigation was not a fixed science, it was a fluid logic, adapting with every mile. The ethics of silence. There's a concept in traditional navigation that is rarely discussed. Who is allowed to know what? Elders and masters often withheld techniques from young apprentices not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Knowledge was power, but misused knowledge was danger. If an apprentice misread Lapa and led a canoe off course, dozens of lives could be lost. So the technique was kept until the student had proved their readiness not just in knowledge, but in temperament. There are stories of master navigators revealing the final pieces of Lapa only on their deathbeds, whispering it to a single air. In some places, this technique was seen not as science but as tapu, sacred, protected, and not to be spoken lightly. This secrecy may be one reason the phenomenon has remained so poorly studied. Even today, some communities refuse to discuss it with outsiders. The voyage of the Hokule and modern Te Lapa. In 1976, a double-hulled canoe named Hokule set sail from Hawaii to Tahiti, using only traditional navigation methods: no compass, no GPS, no sextant. This was more than a voyage. It was a resurrection. It marked the return of a near-lost tradition, and it depended on a single man, Maupiailug. Mau was a master navigator from Satawal, one of the last remaining true wayfinders. He agreed to train Hawaiian navigators in the old ways, using no written tools. Though Mau did not speak of Te Lapa in detail, his techniques echoed its logic. He emphasized silence, stillness, patience, and waiting for signs others could not see. Many of his students later spoke of experiences they could not fully explain, of lights in the water, of feelings in the swell, of paths that opened beneath their canoe at night. They did not need explanation, they had confirmation. The fragility of invisible knowledge. What is most remarkable about Te Lapa is not that it exists, but that it almost didn't. Like so many other indigenous technologies, it hovered at the edge of extinction, endangered not by failure but by disinterest. Colonization, conversion, and modernization pushed these knowledge systems aside, labeling them superstition. The irony is sharp. While modern societies often pride themselves on observation and measurement, they failed to observe or measure the practices that were working quietly for centuries. Even today, if you search for Te Lapa in scientific literature, you'll find only fragments, a few ethnographic reports, a handful of interviews. The knowledge survives not because it was written down, but because someone remembered, because someone kept waiting for the light. A technology of attention. In many ways, Te Lapa and techniques like it are not about the ocean at all. They are about attention, about slowing down, listening closely, and trusting what you sense even when you cannot explain it. This form of navigation is not fast. It is not efficient by modern standards. It does not produce data you can chart on a screen. But it works, and it teaches something else, that survival is not always about tools. Sometimes it is about perception, the ability to notice what others ignore, and to do it again and again and again. As the clouds begin to part, you see a faint glimmer below the canoe, not on the water but under it. It flashes once, then again, always in the same direction. You are still days from land, or are you? What if the island is already watching you? You're still afloat. The ocean is steady but not still. It breathes under you. Above, the clouds have thinned and the stars have returned, not scattered randomly but fixed, as if hung with care. Each one rising from a known place, tracing its arc, then disappearing beneath the other edge of the world. You recognize them now. You are no longer drifting. You are navigating. And you are not alone. You carry a memory not yours, but one you inherited. This is the story of Maupiailug, the last master of an unbroken line, and the canoe that carried a forgotten world back into history. The island of navigators, Satawal. Maupiailug was born in 1932 on the island of Satawal, a dot on the map in Micronesia, barely a mile wide. But to those who know the old ways, Satawal is not small. It is vast, because it holds knowledge that once connected an oceanic empire. For centuries, Satawal had quietly protected one of the last intact schools of traditional navigation in the Pacific. Long after colonization, after missionary pressure, and after Western education swept through nearby islands, Satawal's elders kept the teachings alive. Mau's grandfather, a Palu navigator, began training him at the age of 5. He was taken to the men's house where the teachings began, not with charts but with silence. Night after night they lay on their backs and watched. Stars, swells, winds, shadows on clouds. the invisible signatures of distant islands. By the time Mao was in his teens, he could guide a canoe thousands of miles across open water without instruments, without maps, and without doubt. A knowledge under siege. In the mid-20th century, traditional wayfinding was nearly extinct. Western navigational systems had all but replaced the old ways. Younger generations no longer saw the need to memorize stars or feel for swells. Cargo ships used engines and GPS. Planes cut across the sky in hours. Even on Satawal, the younger men wanted outboard motors. They wanted radios. Mao saw what was coming. He was not angry, but he was watchful. The sea had taught him that knowledge, like waves, could disappear. He began sharing what he knew with anyone who would listen. Not for money, not for fame, but to preserve a knowledge system that had no place in modern schools. He taught in chants, drawings in the sand, and through long voyages. But even he feared that the old ways would die with him. Until one day, a visitor arrived from the east. The Hawaiian revival, and a canoe named Hokule. In the 1970s, Hawaii was going through its own awakening. After generations of cultural suppression, native Hawaiians began to reclaim their language, hula, chants, and history. One of the most powerful symbols of that history was the waiakalua, the traditional double-hulled canoe that had once carried their ancestors across the Pacific. But no such canoe had been built in over 600 years. A group of visionaries came together to change that. They constructed Hokule, a voyaging canoe based on traditional designs. But they faced a problem. While they had the vessel, they no longer had the knowledge to guide it. Modern Hawaiians had lost the art of wayfinding. So they looked west, and they found Maupiailug. Mao's decision. When Mao was invited to Hawaii to guide Hokule on her maiden voyage, to Tahiti, a journey of over 2,500 miles, without modern instruments, he hesitated. He was not Hawaiian. He had never sailed to Tahiti. He knew there would be doubters. But he agreed. Not because he wanted glory, because he believed the knowledge must survive. And if Hawaii could remember what it once knew, others might remember too. In 1976, Mao led Hokule across open ocean using only traditional navigation. The voyage took over a month, but they arrived in Tahiti on target, welcomed by tens of thousands. The world called it a miracle. Mao knew better. It was simply practice. What Mao taught without saying. Mao was a man of few words. His lessons were not given in lectures. He taught through doing, through sailing, through silence, and through trust. He taught his Hawaiian students how to see without seeing, how to lie against the canoe and listen to the swell's rhythm, how to let the stars speak without interrupting them, how to memorize the ocean not by direction, but by feeling. His most famous student, Nainoa Thompson, would go on to become a master navigator himself. But he often said that Mao's greatest gift was not instruction, it was confidence. The belief that Hawaiians could remember, could sail again, and could carry the knowledge forward. And they did. The return voyages. Over the next 4 decades, Hokule would complete voyages across Polynesia, the Pacific Rim, and eventually around the entire planet, all without GPS, in honor of the old ways. Each journey was a form of healing, for Hawaiians, for Polynesians, for the ocean. Other islands followed. Voyaging canoes were revived in New Zealand, Tahiti, the Marquesas, and Samoa. Each time they returned to what was once nearly forgotten, the sky, the swell, and the memory. And Mao watched. He did not need applause. The fact that others now carried the stars in their minds was enough. The end of a line, or the beginning of one. Maupiailug passed away in 2010. He was buried on Satawal. By then, he had trained a generation of Hawaiian wayfinders and had reignited a cultural movement across the Pacific. His death marked the end of something, a direct line of oral navigation that stretched back 1,000 years, uninterrupted. But it was not extinction, because by then, the teachings had been passed on not through textbooks or simulators, but through salt water and silence, just as they always had. Even today, every time a traditional canoe sets sail, Mao sails with it, not in spirit but in practice, in the memory of stars, in the feel of the swell, in the courage to trust the ocean again. The canoe that remembers. The Hokula still sails. It is not a museum piece. It is a living canoe. Every plank carries memory. Every rope holds the tension of decision. Every voyage reaffirms that ancient technologies are not primitive, they are precise. The canoe does not forget. The sea does not forget. And so, if you find yourself one night, flat on your back on the open ocean, with no compass and no GPS, listen closely. The stars will rise where they always have. The swell will murmur. A faint line of light may flicker beneath you. And if you remember how to wait, how to listen, and how to trust the patterns, maybe, just maybe, you'll see it too. A thought for the modern world. What does this all mean for us surrounded by machines, apps, algorithms? It means that memory can live outside books. That science can take the form of a chant. That the most important technologies may not be the ones we build, but the ones we inherit. And that sometimes to move forward we must learn how to lie still, watch, wait, and let the stars find us again. Imagine waking each day not to an alarm clock, but to the roll of a low ocean swell nudging your body beneath the woven mats. Your roof is the sail. Your kitchen is the sea. And the canoe you live on is not just a vessel, it is the entire world. There is no island in sight, and yet you are exactly where you're supposed to be. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, long-distance voyaging was not a romantic expedition. It was a logistical masterpiece, an exercise in patience, planning, and a deep, almost sacred, understanding of daily survival. Before landfall, you had to learn to live on the ocean. This is the story of life on the canoe, not the epic voyage, not the arrival, but the ordinary, deliberate acts that made those journeys possible. The parts history often skips because they are not exciting, and yet they are everything. Not just a boat, the double-hulled canoe as ecosystem. The Polynesian double-hulled canoe, or Waiakalua, was not just a mode of transportation. It was a floating society. Every element of daily life had to be accounted for, from cooking to sleeping, repairing tools to gathering food, resolving conflicts to caring for children. Canoes were generally about 40–70 feet long, consisting of two parallel hulls lashed together with crossbeams. These beams supported a platform made of planks, coconut fiber rope, and woven mats. It was here that life happened. While the voyage may have seemed monotonous days and nights of sea and sky, it was in fact full of structure. Time was marked not by hours but by stars, swell changes, wind shifts, and tasks. Life aboard was ritualized survival. Food and fresh water, the science of preparation. Long-distance voyages could last weeks, even months. There were no opportunities to restock. Everything had to be carried and protected. Water was stored in tightly woven coconut fiber containers or large gourds, then wrapped in leaves to keep cool. Sometimes bamboo tubes were used, capped with banana leaves and resin, but water was heavy and storage space was limited. Navigators had tricks. They reduced consumption by teaching crews to sip sparingly, using salt water to rinse mouths. Rain catching was essential. Crew members rigged mats or sails to funnel rain into containers whenever clouds offered relief. Food was even more complicated. It had to be preserved, lightweight, and easy to store. Common supplies included dried fish, smoked or sun-cured; breadfruit, pounded into paste and wrapped in leaves, then stored in tightly sealed pits or containers; taro, steamed and mashed into a dense, long-lasting cake; coconut, used for both flesh and water. Food was rationed daily, and waste was minimal. Every morsel was precious. Hunger was not dramatic but ever present a low hum beneath every task. Cooking on the sea. You might think cooking over an open fire on a canoe would be impossible, and it nearly was. Most canoes didn't risk open flames. Instead, hot stones were prepared on shore and stored in special compartments to retain heat for the first few days. After that, cooking was rare. Meals were eaten cold. Some crews carried fire-starting tools and risked cooking on sand pits aboard platforms, but the dangers of fire on a wooden, rope-bound canoe were significant. Still, warmth was achieved in other ways. Fermentation was used to pre-cook some starches. Salted meats and soaked taro helped soften texture. The ocean itself, with its salt and sun, was a constant oven and seasoning rack. Work in roles, a floating village. A canoe had no passengers, everyone worked. The navigator, or palu, was not only the pilot but also a spiritual leader. He slept the least, ate the least, and carried the responsibility of survival on his shoulders. His mind was a living map, and his decisions were law. The sailmasters handled the complex task of maneuvering. Changing sails, reading winds, and adjusting angles required constant vigilance. A sudden gust could snap a sail or tip a vessel. The carers, usually elder women on domestic voyages, maintained food stores, treated minor wounds, calmed children, and kept the routines running. Their knowledge of food preservation and herbal remedies was crucial. The young crew handled paddling if necessary, cleaning, repairs, and fetching supplies from storage. They were also the learners, constantly watching and mimicking. Every member had a place and every place mattered. There were no idle hands. Sleep and shelter, when the ocean is your bedroom. Sleeping on the open ocean was not restful. Swells rocked the canoe in constant rhythm. Rain was frequent, wind howled, yet sleep was necessary. Woven sleeping mats provided insulation. Small thatched shelters could be erected at night, collapsible by day. In storms, everyone slept wet. Rotating watches meant that someone was always awake, tracking stars, watching sails, or simply listening for changes in the swell. This was not paranoia, it was discipline. And despite the hardships, the sea became a kind of lullaby. The pitch and roll of the canoe trained the body to rest in motion. Snoring was rare. Silence was currency. Illness, injury, and healing. There were no doctors on board, but there were healers. Injury at sea was inevitable: rope burns, blisters, sunstroke, salt rashes, and minor wounds from fish bones or accidents. Canoes carried simple remedies. Coconut oil for hydration and skin protection. Herbs in dried form for infections or pain. Seawater for cleaning wounds. Clay or mud from riverbanks collected before departure, used as poultices. Healers also addressed spiritual imbalances. If a crew member became ill without clear cause, chants or rituals were performed. Belief was not decoration, it was a medical protocol. Most ailments were minor. The real threats were cumulative: dehydration, exhaustion, exposure. Survival was not about emergency response, it was about prevention. Navigation and routine, the role of repetition. Every morning began the same: observation. The navigator checked the stars if dawn was early, the swells, the clouds, the wind, and the birds. Then the route was adjusted, sometimes slightly, sometimes drastically. Midday was for inspection. Hulls were checked for leaks, ropes retied, food assessed, water levels noted. Evenings brought recalibration. If land was near, birds would return. Clouds would form in specific shapes. Swells might shift. These routines, daily, dull, repetitive, were essential. The ocean did not forgive forgetfulness. Over time, these patterns shaped the minds of the voyagers. They became attuned to small changes, subtle cues. Navigation was not an act, it was a state of being. Children and families aboard. Not all voyages were militaristic or colonial. Some carried whole families to settle new islands. Children were not uncommon, especially in later stages of migration. They were treated not as burdens, but as future navigators. Children learned by imitation. They were not given toys but tasks cleaning, carrying, observing. They were expected to be quiet during star readings and useful during rainstorms. Crying wasted energy. In return, they were taught songs, chants, and names of stars before they could walk. Even on the ocean, education never paused. Some voyagers claim their earliest memories are not of land, but of sky. Conflict and cohesion, social tensions at sea. Life on a canoe was not always harmonious. Close quarters bred irritation. Resources were tight, tempers flared. Yet systems were in place to manage tension. Disputes were mediated by elders or the navigator. Violent conflict was rare. Reconciliation was encouraged, sometimes enforced through ritual. Silence played a role here too. Rather than arguing, those in conflict were often asked to sit apart, facing the ocean, until the wind changed direction. It was a metaphor. When the wind changed, so should you. It wasn't mystical. It was emotional management, quiet, boring, effective. Arrival as anticlimax. After weeks at sea, the sighting of land should have been jubilant. Often it was. Landfall meant new work. Unloading, scouting, starting fires, building shelter. The sea, for all its risks, offered routine. Land meant uncertainty. Still there was relief. Water to drink, food to forage, fire to cook, a horizon that didn't move. But even then the canoe was not abandoned. It was pulled ashore, inspected, revered. In some cases it was buried, in others it was passed on. The canoe had carried a world. It was not forgotten. A question for the present. We often look at ocean voyages as heroic, but perhaps the real heroism lies not in the arrival, but in the endurance of the everyday. The meals that were rationed, the sails that were mended, the watches kept at midnight, the arguments resolved before they could fracture a crew. So, what do we lose when we no longer have to live in such close harmony? What does a canoe know about human resilience that we've forgotten on land? The canoe is now far from any island, surrounded by uninterrupted sea. The days have begun to blur together, swell after swell, wind after wind. But your attention cannot waver. One mistake in the ropes, a crack in the hull, or a torn sail could spell disaster. What held these canoes together for thousands of miles wasn't just wood and fiber. It was a philosophy, simplicity without fragility. Polynesian canoes were not over-engineered. They were maintainable. The sea tested them daily, and in response, they evolved not to resist the ocean but to move with it. This section explores the everyday technology of voyaging canoes, how tools were made, how repairs were done at sea, and how entire systems of survival were based on an understanding of materials most cultures overlooked. Cordage, the rope that held the world together. If there was a single lifeline aboard a canoe, it was cordage. Every plank, crossbeam, sail, and lash was held together with rope, no nails, no glue, no bolts. This wasn't a sign of technological limitation. It was intentional. Nails corrode, glue weakens, but properly tied rope can last for years and be adjusted, tightened, or replaced without taking the structure apart. The primary source of cordage was the inner fibers of the coconut husk, coir. The process of making rope was labor-intensive, and it often began months before a voyage. Here how it worked. Husking. Mature coconuts were husked to extract long fibers from the inner shell. Soaking. Fibers were soaked in seawater for days or weeks to soften them. Drying. The softened fibers were dried under the sun to prevent rot. Twisting. The fibers were twisted into thin threads, then combined into stronger strands through braiding. On board, rolls of spare cordage were kept in dry, elevated places, but even the rope itself was constantly monitored. A loose lashing could unbind a sail or split a hull. Repairing a lashing meant tightening in rhythm with the movement of the sea, not forcing, but flowing. Wood selection and hull construction. Canoe hulls were carved from trees with dense but buoyant wood, light enough to float, strong enough to flex. In Hawaii, koa was preferred. In Samoa, ifalo. In the Cook Islands, tamanu. The construction was modular. Rather than carving a single massive hull, planks were fitted together in segments lashed, not nailed. This gave the canoe flexibility, allowing it to bend with the ocean instead of cracking. Each plank had a name. Each joint was known. When something went wrong, the navigator didn't panic. He diagnosed the specific component, much like a mechanic knows each gear. At sea, small repairs were constant. Smoothing a splinter, tightening a lash, adding a patch made from bark or leaf. For larger hull cracks, the crew used resin from breadfruit or candlenut trees, heated in small pots to create a waterproof seal. Cloth or bark strips, soaked in oil and pressed over the crack. Shell or bone tools, gently whittled to shape for wedge repairs. They didn't need a shipyard. The shipyard was the canoe itself. Sails, woven wind catchers. The sails of Polynesian canoes were often crabclaw-shaped, two booms meeting at an apex, holding a sail made of woven pandanus leaves. Pandanus scrupin leaves were dried, flattened, and woven into tight mats. These mats were then stitched together to form large sail surfaces. They were light, strong, and slightly porous, allowing wind to pass without tearing. Because there was no metal aboard, the weaving of sails had to be perfect. Stitch holes couldn't fray. The booms had to support tremendous pressure without splintering. Crews constantly checked for micro-tears or frayed edges. Sails were also reversed rather than turned. Polynesian canoes often used a technique called shunting. Instead of tacking like European ships, they reversed the direction of the sail while keeping the hull orientation the same. This allowed for more stable course adjustments in high seas. It was a slower maneuver, but far more stable. Toolkits at sea. Every long voyage required a compact toolkit, minimal, durable, and multifunctional. Common tools included shark-tooth knives, mounted on wooden handles with cordage. Shell scrapers, used for smoothing wood and preparing food. Coral hammers, used to crack nuts or tap lashings. Bone awls, for punching holes in leaf sails or bark cloth. Fishbone needles, essential for repairing sails or clothing. No part of an animal or tree was wasted. Tools were repurposed constantly. A broken paddle might become a carving board. A cracked gourd might store dry coals. The economy of objects aboard the canoe was strict and efficient. Repairs were usually collective. If a tool was lost overboard, everyone felt the cost. Navigation tools without tools. It may seem strange, but most navigation was done without physical instruments. Still, some communities used simple guides known as etaks in Micronesia to represent islands or reference points. These were often sticks or shells, laid in specific patterns on woven mats. Star compasses, drawn in ash or scratched into wood as temporary memory aids. Oral chants, which acted as mnemonic devices for swell direction, star positions, and timing. But even these were used mostly before a voyage, during planning. Once underway, the tools were replaced by attention, memory, and feel. The real navigation system was the canoeist's body. Environmental awareness as technology. What modern sailors might call data points, Polynesians experienced as sensations. Temperature change. Slight cooling in the air could signal proximity to land. Salinity, changes in taste hinted at freshwater runoff. Bird behavior. A sudden shift in bird flight patterns warned of storms. Color of the sea. The water near islands had different hues, often tinged green or gray compared to deep blue. These indicators didn't appear on maps. They had to be felt. and feeling them required quiet observation, stillness, and trust in the smallest signals. This awareness was the most fragile part of the technology. It couldn't be packed or tied or repaired. It lived only in people. Daily checklists without paper. Each morning, the navigator and crew performed a mental checklist, often silently. Hull check, any signs of leaks, cracks, or water retention. Lashing check, are any ropes fraying, loosening, or swelling from salt? Sail check, are the seams intact? Has wind stress changed the shape? Storage check, are water containers still sealed? Is any food fermenting? Weather check, what clouds are forming? What birds are visible? Is the swell changing? These checks were not optional. They were the difference between drifting aimlessly and arriving safely. And they were learned. Apprentices were trained not just in actions but in sequence. One day they would lead, and they would have no manuals. Why simplicity wasn't simpler. To the outside world, this system may appear primitive: wood, leaves, shells, chance. But that assumption misses the most critical truth. These technologies endured longer than most empires. They crossed distances Europeans didn't dare attempt until much later. They survived storms. They delivered people to islands the size of pinpricks, guided only by the clouds and the memory of stars. Simplicity was not lack, it was refinement. What breaks, what lasts? The sea corrodes, it tests, it exposes weakness, and in doing so it teaches. Most failures weren't dramatic. They were slow, a rope unraveling unnoticed, a plank softening from salt, a lash swelling from humidity. The best canoe builders didn't make indestructible boats. They made boats you could fix, quickly, with what you had. The philosophy extended beyond tools. It was a worldview. Systems should bend, not break. They should last long enough to be passed on. A question for now. Modern systems are built for convenience. When they fail, we replace them. But Polynesian canoes weren't disposable. They demanded care. Maintenance was built into survival. So we ask, what might we relearn from a world where everything had to be understood, not just used? When every part of your life depends on repair, does that change how you live? The ocean has faded behind you now. Land lies ahead, low and green at the edge of the horizon, smelling of soil and unfamiliar trees. The canoe slows. The crew grows quiet, even though they have seen this before. You are not finished. You are arriving, and arrival, though often celebrated in song and story, was not the climax of the voyage. It was a shift, a beginning of something new. This is the story of what happened after the sea. The first days on new shores, the lessons the canoe taught that didn't vanish once your feet touched land, the way in which seafaring didn't just guide migration but shaped entire societies, economies, and cultures. Quietly, persistently, and still. Landfall, the anticlimactic celebration. Contrary to dramatic imagination, first landfall was not always triumphant. There were no flags, no cheers, no drums echoing from cliffs. More often it was cautious, slow, and filled with work. Before approaching the beach, scouts observed the land for signs of habitation, dangers, or resources. Smoke on the wind, bird types, insects, color of the river outflow. They rarely rushed to shore. When it was deemed safe, a landing was made carefully. Canoes were often carried up the beach, stored above the high tide line. Hulls were inspected. Lashings were dried. The canoe had survived, and it needed rest too. The crew, likewise, did not scatter joyfully. They rationed water until a freshwater source was confirmed. They cooked slowly only when wood was found. Sleeping under trees was avoided at first. Unknown insects, unfamiliar spirits. Caution wasn't fear, it was experience. The first priorities, rebuilding daily life. Once basic safety was confirmed, priorities emerged in quiet succession. Water, finding a clean running source was the first task. Springs, river mouths, or rain catchments off cliffs were mapped. Shelter. Temporary lean-tos were constructed with palm or pandanus leaves, fast to build, fast to abandon. Fire. Fire was essential not only for food and warmth but as a psychological anchor. Flames signaled settlement, not survival. Food. Scouting parties searched for edible plants. Known species like taro or banana were prized. Unknown ones were tested in slow increments, using standard techniques, rubbing on the skin, waiting for irritation, tasting, waiting again. At night, watch rotations resumed. The habits of the sea guarding, rationing, repairing followed them ashore. The canoe taught them not to trust abundance too quickly. Canoes as cultural cargo. While the canoe carried people and tools, it also carried ideas, social structures, rituals, language patterns, even music. Island societies that sprang from these landfalls didn't invent cultures anew. They planted fragments of older worlds, adapting them to the new soil. Canoe voyages became the unacknowledged parents of daily life on land. Examples. Genealogies were maintained with the same discipline as star paths. Lineage was a navigational tool tracing descent, inheritance, social position. Timekeeping remained based on stars and moons, even when land calendars emerged. Decision-making often followed the logic of a canoe crew. Shared consensus, respect for elders, punishment for those who endangered the group. Architecture reflected canoe design. Lashings, curves, raised platforms, central poles. Even rituals echoed life at sea. Some initiation ceremonies required youths to sleep alone near the water, listening to swells. Others began with chants sung in canoe rhythm, timed to paddling cadence. Land did not erase the canoe, it translated it. Rebuilding from memory. When islands were barren or unwelcoming, settlers began recreating the worlds they had left. They planted the canoe crops transported deliberately. Taro for starch and leaves. Breadfruit long-lasting, highly nutritious. Banana fast-growing and flexible. Coconut water, oil, wood, rope. Yam ritual and food. Sugar cane, paper, mulberry for bark cloth, turmeric and kava. These plants were not just survival tools. They were cultural continuity. They brought with them songs, stories, taboos, and planting rituals tied to moon phases and star calendars. In this way, even the dirt beneath new feet was stitched with memories of the voyage. Canoe logic in society. Island societies born from voyages retained a practical humility. Their political systems were shaped by canoe logic, a culture of resource management, risk reduction, and shared responsibility. Here are a few examples. Rotating leadership. If a leader failed to maintain harmony or caused suffering, as a navigator might steer into danger, they could be replaced by consensus. Tapu systems. These regulated access to resources, especially during scarcity, mirroring rationing at sea. Reciprocal alliances. Chiefs often exchanged goods and marriage partners between islands to maintain peace, like the inter-island trust required for navigation stopovers. Knowledge protection. Navigational knowledge, like many forms of knowledge ashore, was protected through training, lineage, and ritual, not mass instruction. These systems weren't mystical. They were pragmatic, born of lived necessity and the psychology of long voyages where a single conflict could doom everyone aboard. The canoe as myth, memory, and metaphor. Over time, the physical canoes wore down. Some were buried, others became ceremonial, but the idea of the canoe never left. In chants, gods arrived in canoes. In origin stories, ancestors crossed seas in vessels of bone or shell or wind. Canoes became the measure of greatness. A chief might be praised not for his wealth, but for how many voyages he led or how far his canoes reached. Some genealogies were structured not just by bloodlines but by routes taken, islands reached, mistakes made. When someone died, they were said to have gone back into the sea. Some were buried with miniature canoes beside them. Some were launched in funeral boats. Even today, elders might tell you, the canoe is not gone, you are in it still. Modern remnants of a seafaring mindset. Centuries after the voyages slowed, their memory remains embedded in island culture in subtle ways. The way elders teach by silence, not instruction. The way villagers prepare extra food in case someone arrives unexpectedly, a habit from resupplying passing canoes. The presence of star names in lullabies. The common use of cardinal directions in everyday speech. The instinct to listen to wind, tide, birds, even in the city. These are not artifacts, they are habits, and they whisper of a time when survival meant tuning yourself to the rhythms of the sea. A legacy that almost disappeared. As we've seen, this way of life, quiet, practical, rooted in discipline, nearly vanished under the weight of colonialism, modernity, and dismissal. Westerners admired the daring of the voyages, but ignored the boring brilliance that sustained them. Navigation was called superstition. The canoes were dismissed as primitive. Survival skills were replaced with imported goods. But in the past few decades, something shifted. As the world has grown louder, more complicated, more automated, people have begun listening again to the quiet logic of the canoe. Canoe building has returned. Star navigation is being taught again. Canoe voyages are not reenactments, they are resurrections. Not nostalgia, continuity. What the canoe still teaches us. The canoe isn't about exoticism. It isn't about adventure stories or peril on the high seas. It's about structure, routine, maintenance, and humility. It teaches us that survival is not made of miracles, but of thousands of small, careful decisions made every day. That tools should be repairable. That roles should be clear. That trust is built over long distances, in silence, in patience. And most of all, that when you travel together, everything matters. You've arrived now, but the journey doesn't end. The sea doesn't end. The canoe in some form is always with you. So next time you fix something by hand, or ration carefully, or pay attention to the wind, you may be closer to a 1,000-year-old voyage than you realize. It is night again, deep night. The moon has not risen and the stars are scattered behind cloud banks. The canoe sits still, sails pulled in, drifting quietly under a heavy sky. There are no birds, no breeze, only the sound of small waves tapping against the hull like the ticking of an invisible clock. You lie motionless, half submerged along the canoe's edge, eyes fixed not on the sky but on the water, waiting. And then you see it. A flash, a shimmer, a quick pulse of light like lightning darting just beneath the ocean's surface. It lasts a second, then it vanishes. You do not speak. You've been told what this means. You've just seen tilapia. What is tilapia? To the untrained eye, tilapia may seem like an illusion, an ephemeral line of light flashing underwater in a straight line toward land. But to traditional Polynesian navigators, it was far more than a curiosity. Tilapia was a signal, a directional beam of light that, if followed, could lead a canoe directly to an island that was otherwise invisible on the horizon. It could appear at night when no other signs were available, no birds, no clouds, no scent of land. It was fast, faint, and always precise. A navigational tool more reliable than stars on a cloudy night. And yet, for centuries, most of the world didn't even know it existed. First accounts from navigators. Tilapia has been known among traditional seafarers for generations. In oral traditions from the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, the Marquesas, and Kiribati, navigators spoke of seeing these flashes of light when sailing near land. Descriptions varied slightly, but the core elements were always the same. The light flashed underwater. It traveled in a perfectly straight line. It always pointed directly to land, never away from it. It could only be seen at night. in total silence and stillness. In some traditions, it was described as a flickering eel or lightning in the sea. In others, it was called the light that lives in the bones of the earth. Yet for centuries, these stories were ignored, even dismissed. A knowledge hidden in plain sight. Part of the mystery of Lapa lies not in the phenomenon itself, but in how it survived hidden, yet practiced. Why wasn't it more widely known? Because like many Polynesian navigational techniques, it was considered tapu sacred, secret, restricted. In many communities, only master navigators or selected apprentices were permitted to speak about it. Others, even crew members, were told nothing. This wasn't superstition, it was pragmatism. If an inexperienced sailor misread Lapa and led a canoe astray, the consequences could be fatal. So the knowledge was protected, passed down carefully, whispered only when the time was right. In some cultures, the knowledge of Lapa was passed only on the deathbed of an elder navigator to a single successor. Conditions for seeing Lapa. Not everyone could see Lapa. Even among navigators, it was considered a rare and specialized skill. The right conditions had to align. No moonlight. The night had to be pitch black. Moonlight washed out the faint underwater flashes. Stillness of the water. Swells could obscure the light. Calm seas were best. Clear, shallow water. Murky or deep ocean made the flash harder to see. Dark adaptation. Navigators had to lie motionless for long periods, eyes adjusted to darkness. Mental stillness. Many claimed that the light wouldn't reveal itself to those who were anxious, impatient, or unfocused. Lapa was not a tool you could summon. It was one you had to wait for, and often the waiting itself was a test. Training the eye. In Micronesia, it was said that training for Lapa began not with watching the sea, but with watching yourself. Young apprentices were told to spend entire nights lying on their stomachs, eyes level with the water, doing nothing, not scanning, not searching, just seeing, letting their vision go soft, letting their minds quiet. Only then, they were told, might the light appear. If it did, they weren't to celebrate. They were to observe it again. Consistency was crucial. A single flash could be ignored, but if it appeared repeatedly in the same line, it was real. It meant land was nearby, often within 40-60 kilometers. Some say they could see it up to 100 kilometers away, but only in perfect conditions. Even then, it might last just a second. Scientific theories and their limits. Modern science has tried to understand Lapa with mixed results. Several theories have been proposed. Electro-optical pulses. Some suggest that islands emit low-level electromagnetic pulses that interact with seawater conductivity, creating a visual flash. Bioluminescence. The motion of deep-sea organisms or chemical changes in the water column near islands might create brief bursts of light. Refraction of light. Moonlight or starlight might reflect off shallow reef edges or island terrain and travel underwater in straight lines. Internal waves or thermoclines. Changes in water density or temperature may channel light in specific directions. Yet no theory has fully explained why the light only seems to point to land, nor why it appears beneath the surface, nor why it behaves consistently enough for trained navigators to rely on it over generations. The most honest scientific position remains: we don't know. Anthropologists begin to listen. In the late 20th century, ethnographers and anthropologists began documenting Lapa seriously. Researchers like Marion George conducted interviews with elderly navigators, gathering descriptions and first-hand accounts. What they found was not mysticism, but detailed consistency. Nearly every elder described the flash as moving toward land, not randomly. Many had used it to change course and successfully reach islands otherwise undetectable. Some had never spoken of it outside their community, for fear of ridicule or desecration. In 2007, George and other researchers witnessed the phenomenon firsthand during a voyage near Tomako Island in the Solomons. The light appeared exactly as described: quick, underwater, direct. Even with modern instruments, they could not explain it. Tilapa as a navigational backup. Polynesian navigation relies on multiple signs: stars, swells, birds, clouds, and colors. Tilapa was not the primary tool. It was a backup, a verification. When the stars were gone and the swell was shifting, and birds hadn't returned, Tilapa might be the last signal. But it was never taken alone. Navigators were trained not to believe one sign too quickly. They triangulated, they waited, they tested. Tilapa confirmed what other signs hinted at, and when it aligned, they steered toward it with complete faith. In this way, Tilapa was part of a network of trust, not an isolated miracle. Cultural interpretations. Some cultures saw Tilapa as the spirit line of the island, a pulse of ancestral energy extending into the sea, inviting wayfarers home. Others described it as the island's tongue, a signal that the land was awake, watching, speaking. In some stories, islands were said to hunt canoes, reaching out with Tilapa to pull them in. In others, only the worthy could see the light, and the untrained would be left blind in the sea. These interpretations, while poetic, also served practical purposes. They discouraged careless reliance. They reinforced the idea that Tilapa was sacred and should be used only with humility. A fragile memory. As modern technology took hold, engines, radios, GPS, the use of Tilapa faded. Young sailors scoffed, elders grew quiet, some stopped teaching. By the early 2000s, there were only a handful of living navigators who claimed to use Tilapa regularly. But in a twist of fate, the silence saved it. Because it was hidden, it remained intact, unflattened by outsiders, uncommercialized, uninterpreted. And now, with renewed interest in traditional navigation, the knowledge is slowly returning. Carefully, respectfully, still whispered but no longer ignored. A question seen, not answered. If the sea can flash light toward land consistently, reliably, what else does it know that we haven't learned to see? What signs are we missing, simply because we've stopped waiting in silence? What else might appear if we were still enough? You've now seen the first glimmer of Tilapa and explored how it was known, hidden, and rediscovered. The ocean has quieted again. You lie with your eyes low to the surface, no stars to guide you, no birds to reassure you. And yet there it is. A flicker straight, silent Tilapa. It pulses just once this time, but you don't question it. You've been taught not to. You remember the stories, the nights of training, the voices of elders who said, if you see it twice and it points the same way, trust it. Now we explore how Tilapa was learned not through diagrams or devices, but through attention. What does it mean to train your body, your vision, and your mind to detect the invisible? And how did entire societies preserve this knowledge without writing it down? The learning environment, a canoe with no classroom. In traditional seafaring societies, there were no schools in the modern sense. No desks, no chalkboards, no notebooks, and certainly no diagrams of light behavior beneath salt water. Learning Tilapa was done through apprenticeship. A master navigator, or palu, might select one or two apprentices, usually children, showing early patience, strong memory, and interest in the sea. The first lessons had nothing to do with Tilapa. They started with silence. The apprentices were instructed to watch the sky for hours, sometimes days, without speaking. They would memorize star paths, track their rise and fall, and then recite them aloud under supervision, and always during calm moments on deck. When the apprentice had proven they could listen without interruption, stay awake during long watches, and recognize when not to speak, the next level of training began: sea reading. Only then would Tilapa be mentioned sparingly, quietly. Training exercises, sensory immersion. The best training ground was the canoe itself. During real voyages, apprentices were sometimes assigned to lie prone at the edge of the hull, close to the waterline, for hours, for days, even when there were no signs of tilapia. The point was not to see it, but to prepare to see it properly when the time came. They practiced lowering visual input, staring not at the waves but through them. Soft focus, widening peripheral vision, similar to how hunters scan forests or fishermen watch for disturbance in still water. Stillness, remaining completely motionless, even when the sea rocked or flying fish slapped the hull. Shadow tracking, watching how different light moved under the surface, bioluminescence from disturbed plankton, moonlight filtered by clouds, and eventually, tilapia itself. Some masters would even test students with subtle distractions, splashing water or tossing small debris to see if the apprentice would break focus. It wasn't just about vision, it was about discipline of attention. Recognizing the real. Navigators made a crucial distinction between tilapia and false signals. There were many. Bioluminescence could shimmer when fish stirred water, or when the canoe moved across plankton blooms. Wave reflections might trick the eye during moonlit nights. Lightning in the sky might confuse an inexperienced observer. The real tilapia, elders taught, was directional, always in a straight line, pointing only toward land. Quick, a single pulse or a few, never sustained glow. Beneath the surface, unlike lightning or moonlight. Silent, never accompanied by sound or fish motion. Only after an apprentice could distinguish between true and false flashes, repeatedly, would they be trusted to act on the signal. The role of repetition and memory. Because tilapia sightings were rare, teaching often relied on memory-based reinforcement. Elders used story, chants, and metaphor to instill the logic of what tilapia meant. A typical teaching chant might go, "The eel of light darts without turning, from deep bone toward land's breath. Twice it blinks and 3 times confirms. Trust not the fish that dances in wind." This was not just poetry, it encoded essential principles. The eel tilapia moves without deviation. Land's breath refers to island-associated currents or air patterns. Seeing it once is not enough, twice is key. Don't mistake natural light from marine life. Apprentices were expected to memorize these verses, recite them, and eventually use them as navigational logic. Practicing without the sea. Even on land, training continued. Children were sometimes taken to dark caves or water holes to train their night vision. In complete darkness, they were asked to notice subtle changes in light and shadow. These practices prepared their eyes and minds for the unique visual environment of the ocean at night. Elders also used symbolic tests. They would describe hypothetical situations. You are 3 days from island. There is no wind. The stars are gone. You see a shimmer at sea level, fast and thin. What do you do? Answers weren't graded. They were discussed, not right or wrong, but explored through conversation. The goal was alignment, not certainty. This type of training built both judgment and humility. Why so few were taught? Not every navigator passed tilapia knowledge on. There were practical reasons. Risk of misinterpretation. As mentioned earlier, a wrong call could end in disaster. Selective memory. With no written records, oral knowledge could decay. Only those with near-perfect memory were trusted. Sacredness. Tilapia was often associated with ancestral spirits. In some regions, it was believed that to misuse the signal was to anger those who provided it. Some elders insisted tilapia was not a light at all but a spirit communication, that it could not be taught to those who did not carry the right ancestral lineage. Others believed it was a gift, but one that needed refinement through discipline. In both views, the outcome was the same. The knowledge was guarded. cultural preservation through secret. Paradoxically, keeping T. Lapa secret may have ensured its survival. When European explorers documented Polynesian societies, they largely missed the complexity of navigation. They saw no compasses, no maps, no instruments, and concluded that such societies were primitive. Had T. Lapa been widely explained, it may have been dismissed, misinterpreted, or even outlawed by colonial regimes as other superstitious practices were. Instead, it remained in the shadows, protected, passed quietly from teacher to student like an ember carried in cupped hands. Even today, there are families who will only speak of it in hushed tones. Even today, there are canoe builders who know the phenomenon but will not name it. A modern resurgence. With the revival of Polynesian voyaging in recent decades, led by projects like the Hokulea and the Polynesian Voyaging Society, there's renewed interest in T. Lapa. Some navigators, such as those trained by the late master Malpiailug, have described seeing the flashes on modern voyages. They often do not share details publicly, out of respect for tradition. But quietly, across the Pacific, small groups are once again training apprentices. They use modern language to describe ancient perception. Your mind must be still before your eye can see. The signal is there. You must make yourself able to receive it. Don't look for the light, let the light look for you. T. Lapa is no longer being forgotten, but neither is it being explained. It is being felt, respected, and practiced the same way it always was. Beyond the flash, a philosophy of perception. At its core, T. Lapa is not just a navigational tool, it's a metaphor. It asks us to slow down, to notice what is subtle, to distinguish between what is urgent and what is real. It teaches that the most important signals in life may not be the loudest, that what you need to survive may not arrive on schedule but may blink once, faintly, and then disappear, and that you must be ready to recognize it. That's what T. Lapa is. Not lightning. Lightning you can only see if you've learned how to wait. So now, if you were to lie still on the deck, in perfect silence in the dark between stars, and see the shimmer again, would you act? Or would you wait for confirmation? Would you trust a signal the modern world doesn't believe in? The pulse comes again. A line of light, sharp and quick, flashes beneath the water. Then another. You don't shout, you don't even speak. You gently shift the sail, adjust the canoe's angle, and hold your breath. You are no longer navigating by stars, or birds, or swell. You are following a light that no compass detects, no satellite records, no screen displays. You are following T. Lapa, the most silent signal of land, and you're nearly there. This final section explores what T. Lapa means in the context of modern life, not just as a navigational curiosity, but as a living metaphor for attention, trust, and ancestral knowledge. We'll look at the journeys of those who have revived it, the ongoing mysteries that surround it, and what it teaches about our relationship to nature and ourselves. T. Lapa and the canoes that found it again. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, renewed voyages across the Pacific brought T. Lapa back into the consciousness of seafaring communities. During training voyages for Hokulea and other traditional canoes such as Fafate, Maru Maru Adwa, and Okanos, several navigators quietly began documenting sightings of T. Lapa. It was never central to navigation. Still, they recorded flashes observed in open water, long before land was visible. Repetition of pulses over several nights, all pointing in the same direction. Correlation between T. Lapa and confirmed island landfalls. These accounts were often kept within the navigator circles, not for secrecy, but out of respect. The light had returned, and so had the reverence around it. This was not a rediscovery, it was a reaffirmation. Navigators who saw the light. Among the few who have spoken publicly about T. Lapa are Malpiailug, While he rarely discussed Lapa directly, his students recalled moments when he changed course after long silence, only to land on an island days later with no other visible signs. When asked how he knew, he simply said, "The sea told me." Nainoa Thompson, trained under Mao, he acknowledged witnessing underwater flashes during night watches. Though he emphasized a triangulation of methods, he never dismissed what he saw. "There are things the ocean knows," he once said, "that we are just starting to listen to again." Lino Ueli of Tomako. As part of the Vaca Tomako project, he taught apprentices traditional canoe building and navigational knowledge, including the recognition of Lapa. He stressed patience. "If you chase the light, it will hide. You must invite it." These testimonies, soft, careful, sincere, mirror the quality of Lapa itself. The scientific boundary remains uncrossed. Despite increased interest, Lapa remains unexplained by modern science. Researchers have attempted to capture the phenomenon using underwater cameras, spectrographs, and electromagnetic sensors. To date, no definitive recordings exist. Attempts to simulate it through modeling of island-generated internal waves, underwater light diffraction, or bioelectric pulses remain theoretical. But perhaps the limitation lies not in the tools but in the approach. The scientific method values replication and isolation, but Lapa requires context and presence. It may be that what is being seen is not measurable in traditional terms. Or perhaps it is, but only when seen by a body trained in silence, patience, and rhythm. Maybe the light is real, or maybe the ability to see it is. Either way, it raises the same question. What do we miss by assuming the visible world contains all that matters? Spiritual dimensions, land that calls you. For many Pacific cultures, islands are alive, not metaphorically but quite literally. They are ancestors, they breathe, they wait. In this context, Lapa is not merely a beam of light, it is the island reaching out, calling its people home. Some believe that Lapa can only be seen by those invited by the land, that it is a test of character, lineage, or readiness. Others believe that the canoe must be in balance, the crew in harmony, the journey aligned with ancestral purpose. In this view, Lapa is not a tool, it is a relationship. To be seen by the light is to be known by the land. Memory without paper. What Lapa also teaches us is how fragile and powerful oral knowledge can be. Had it been written down centuries ago, labeled, categorized, subjected to external validation, it might have been reduced to a dismissed oddity. But because it was held within families, passed slowly, protected, it survived. Now modern navigators walk a careful line. Some are working to document Lapa responsibly, collaborating with elders who give permission. Others choose to let it remain oral, embedded in chants, stories, and practices. There is no single right answer. What matters is consent, context, and community. The story of Lapa cannot be separated from the people who carry it. It cannot be uploaded to a server. It must be lived. What Lapa teaches beyond the sea. Though few of us will ever lie flat on a voyaging canoe at night, the principles behind Lapa can still guide us. It reminds us to practice stillness. The signal won't appear when we're frantic. It reveals itself to the calm, the quiet, the patient. Trust patterns. Even fleeting signals, when repeated, offer direction. Train attention. Seeing is not a passive act. It's a practiced, active engagement. Respect the unseen. Not everything of value is immediately visible or explainable. Wait for confirmation. One flash might be illusion. Two or more may be a calling. And perhaps most of all, to understand that landfall success, insight, clarity often arrives not through control, but through receptiveness. The return of the light. Today, across the Pacific, canoes once again cut across blue water under the same stars their ancestors followed. Many of them carry no electronics. Some carry solar panels and radios for safety, but still navigate by the old ways. And some still report seeing the flash. They do not chase it. They wait. They steer gently. And often, the light guides them to places no map suggested. Tilapa remains not as a curiosity, but as a living thread between generations. The final lesson of the lightning below. Tilapa is not a myth. It's a question. A quiet one, pulsing just beneath the surface of our understanding. It asks us whether we still know how to listen to the sea, to the land, to the voices of elders, to the glimmers of truth that don't fit in manuals. It asks whether we trust the flash we see in the dark, even if no one else sees it. It asks whether we are ready to steer our lives, not by instruments but by attention, memory, and care. Because sometimes, when everything else is gone, no stars, no wind, no voices, the ocean will speak. Just once, and you will have to decide whether to follow. You walk into a hut on a Micronesian atoll low to the ground, shaded by palm thatch, the air heavy with salt. Inside, you see something hanging on the wall, a web of sticks, arched and lashed in strange curves. Small cowrie shells are tied here and there. It doesn't resemble any map you know. It's not for decoration. It's a navigational chart, a rebelib, or perhaps a meadow. It tells of swells, islands, reflection points, and wave patterns. But it only speaks to those who have memorized its language. And once it has been learned, it is never consulted at sea. Because this isn't a map to use, it's a map to remember. This is the story of how ancient Pacific navigators encoded entire oceans in sticks and shells, and how they taught generations to read the water like a book. The canoe is the ship, the ocean is the road, the chart is the memory. The ocean is not empty space in Micronesian thought. It is full structured, textured, and patterned. And those patterns can be mapped not with coastlines or compass roses, but with sticks and shells representing swells and islands, respectively. The Marshall Islands, in particular, developed a sophisticated tradition of wave navigation. Because their islands were low-lying and often difficult to see from afar, their navigators paid close attention to swell refraction, how waves bent, bounced, and collided as they moved around islands. These patterns could be predictable, and once memorized, they could be taught. Thus was born the stick chart, a training device and mnemonic tool used by navigators to study oceanic conditions before departure. The three main types of stick charts. There were several kinds of stick charts, each with a different function. The most well-documented ones are Meadow, a localized chart showing a small number of islands and the wave interactions around them. Rebelib, a more extensive chart that covers entire archipelagos, often including dozens of islands and complex swell routes. Mattang, a conceptual training chart, not depicting specific places, but rather teaching the fundamental principles of wave refraction and reflection. Let's look closer. 1. Meadow, practical, personal, precise. A meadow chart focuses on just a few islands, usually familiar to the chartmaker. Thin coconut midribs are curved or crossed to show how primary and secondary swells move between islands. Straight sticks show main swell directions. Curved sticks indicate reflected or refracted waves. Shells or knots represent island locations. Each meadow was unique, customized by the navigator who built it. It might not make sense to anyone else, but to its maker and to the apprentice trained with it, it told an entire story of motion across water. 2. Rebelib, the ocean as a region. The Rebelib charts were larger and more comprehensive. They could span hundreds of miles and dozens of islands. While Western maps emphasize fixed geography, the Rebelib emphasized relationships, the shape of swells between islands, the way currents changed with wind season, the long-distance echoes of land masses that influenced sea patterns far away. These charts required years to master. They were not carried on voyages but studied beforehand. Once memorized, they lived in the mind, allowing the navigator to see the swell paths as they traveled. 3. Matting, the Rosetta Stone of wave thinking. The matting is perhaps the most philosophical of the stick charts. It doesn't represent islands at all. Instead, it depicts how waves behave around a single point like an island. It shows the interaction of primary swells with the island, reflected and refracted wave paths, crossover zones where swell energies intersect. These were used to train perception. A navigator in training might stare at a matting for hours, then go to the beach and lie in the water, feeling the rhythms. Over time, they would learn to recognize these interactions through touch alone. It was the grammar of the ocean. How stick charts were made. Materials were chosen with care. Main lines: coconut midribs, long, slender, and naturally flexible. Joints: coconut fiber cordage or plant twine. Island markers: cowrie shells, small stones, or knots of sennet. Construction was itself a form of meditation. Builders spoke little. They curved and lashed by memory, often guided by decades of observation. And when the chart was done, it wasn't considered complete until it was transferred into the body. Using the charts without using them. Stick charts were never brought on voyages. Not because they weren't useful, but because they weren't needed anymore. Once learned, they became internal. The navigator could feel the relationships. They had studied the curve of the swell, the slap of a cross current, the timing between wave peaks. At sea, memory guided the canoe. This wasn't just rote memorization. It was embodied knowledge. The stick chart didn't represent information, it represented experience. Teaching through touch. Navigators trained apprentices by combining charts with direct exposure. They would sit on the shore, chart in hand, feeling the waves. Lie chest down on canoe decks, eyes closed, and name swell directions. Practice predicting land proximity by reading wave interference patterns. Engage in oral questioning. If the swell comes from here and you pass the first island, what happens to the reflection? Training could take years. Success was not marked by passing a test, but by completing a voyage. Wave piloting, reading the ocean by motion. Beyond charts, experienced navigators practiced wave piloting, the art of sensing swells with the body. Lying prone on the canoe, they could detect primary swell, the main pulse of energy, steady and strong. Secondary swell, reflected from distant land, subtler but still traceable. Tertiary swell, a rare, echoing interference pattern hinting at large islands or submerged reefs. By tracking how these swells intersected, at what angles, at what intensity, the navigator could estimate direction, distance, and even speed toward land. This system was developed long before Western wave theory, and yet it aligns with modern understandings of swell interference, diffraction, and island shadowing. Once again, what appears primitive is simply precise but unspoken. Stick charts as technology of mind. We tend to think of technology as machinery or electronics, but the stick charts challenge that notion. They were portable, customizable, renewable, resilient, accurate, and most importantly designed to be obsolete once learned. Like a scaffolding removed after the building is complete, the chart was only a vehicle for building memory. This is cognitive technology, tools for the brain. Western encounters and misunderstandings. When Western explorers first encountered stick charts in the 19th century, they were baffled. European cartographers tried to decode them using their own geographic logic. They assumed that each line corresponded to latitude and longitude. When the charts didn't align with known coastlines, they dismissed them as symbolic, ritualistic, or decorative. Few bothered to ask the builders what the charts meant. Only much later did ethnographers begin to listen, and to realize that these inaccurate charts were in fact accurate depictions of wave dynamics, not geography. The mistake was not in the chart, but in the lens used to view it. A fragile survival. Today, only a handful of traditional chart makers remain. The knowledge is fragile not because it is invalid, but because it has been ignored. Some younger Marshallese navigators have begun to revive the practice. In schools and workshops, elders are teaching children how to build and interpret charts again. Modern replicas are sometimes made from plastic and twine, others from driftwood and shell. The method changes, the principle remains. And like the stars, the swells have not forgotten. A question of cartography. What if a map didn't just tell you where you were, but how the world moved around you? What if it taught you to listen before you sailed? What if it disappeared once you learned its lesson? Would you trust a map that was never meant to be looked at twice? The canoe drifts again, but your eyes are closed. You're not watching the horizon. You're feeling the ocean beneath you, its rise and fall, the tempo of its heartbeat. A steady swell rocks from one side. Another cuts across it diagonally. You don't need to ask where you are. You already know. You are inside the ocean's memory, reading it not with eyes or charts, but with your spine. This section delves deeper into the lived experience of wave navigation. How Pacific navigators moved across vast distances using wave refraction, island shadows, and interference patterns. We'll explore how the knowledge encoded in stick charts was activated in the body, and why it worked not in theory, but in daily practice. The sea is not flat. To a casual observer, the ocean's surface might appear featureless, a flat, undulating expanse. But to the trained navigator, it is a textured field of invisible signals. Each island, each reef, disrupts the regularity of ocean swells. These disruptions ripple outward in predictable ways. If you know how to read them, they become as reliable as road signs. Let's break this down. Primary swell, the ocean's steady pulse. Swells are long wavelength waves generated by distant winds, sometimes storms hundreds of miles away. By the time these swells reach island regions, they have been smoothed into a regular rhythm. This primary swell is the ocean's background music, consistent, predictable, and, crucially, measurable by feel. Navigators could sense the direction of the primary swell by lying down and feeling the canoe's roll. A perfectly aligned canoe would rise and fall evenly. If the angle changed, so did the relationship to the swell and therefore the heading. Reflected swell, the island's invisible echo. Here, where the brilliance of wave navigation begins. When a primary swell strikes an island or atoll, part of its energy is reflected, bouncing back out to sea at a specific angle. This reflected swell is subtler, but perceptible to those trained to detect it. On a calm day, the interaction between primary and reflected swells creates a cross-swell pattern, a physical interference grid across the water's surface. At the intersections, the canoe rocks irregularly. These changes in motion can be felt through the hull. Navigators use this to estimate distance from an island based on the strength of the reflected swell. Direction to the island by tracing the angle of the echo. Size of the island. Larger islands cast larger reflected swells. Island shadowing, the negative map. Another essential concept, swell shadows. An island not only reflects waves, it also blocks them. On the leeward side of an island, the primary swell weakens. This creates a region of calmer water. Experienced navigators could feel this change in rhythm as they passed through it. Island shadows became part of the navigator's mental map. A skilled wayfinder could say, "We've just entered the shadow of a reef we can't see yet," and adjust course accordingly. This wasn't guesswork, it was tactile cartography. Cross swells and navigational triangulation. Rarely did a navigator rely on a single swell. They used multiple concurrent swells, which often came from different sources. Let's say you're between two islands. Island A reflects swell X. Island B reflects swell Y. The open ocean still carries the primary swell Z. Now, your canoe is rocked by three overlapping movements, each with its own tempo, direction, and strength. Navigators learned to disentangle these swells by pattern recognition and memory. They could say, swell Z is open ocean, it's always present. Swell X arrives every 11 seconds, it's from Island A. Swell Y is softer and wider, it's from Island B. By monitoring how these swells changed over time and space, they could triangulate their position with remarkable accuracy. It was not intuitive, it was learned over years. The body as sensor array. Traditional voyaging canoes weren't engineered for luxury. They were low to the water, with minimal interference between the ocean and the navigator's body. This design served a purpose. Navigators would lie prone, sometimes on the center beam of the canoe, sometimes at the very front with their chests, arms, or cheekbones in contact with the hull. What were they sensing? Amplitude, height of the swell. Frequency, timing between crests. Directionality, the angle of motion. Interference, rhythms, beats formed by overlapping swells. It was said that the best navigators could detect a 3-degree shift in wave direction, not with instruments, with bones. Lessons from modern science. Oceanographers who have studied swell behavior in the Pacific have confirmed what Pacific Islanders long knew. Swell energy refracts and reflects predictably around islands. Interference patterns can be modeled using physics. Island shadows and echoes can persist for dozens of miles. But traditional navigators discovered and exploited this information generations before any such measurements were taken. They didn't need Fourier analysis. They had immersion, observation, and embodied learning. Science is now catching up to confirm what these navigators felt through experience. Case study, the Tomako Project. The Vaca Tomako Project in the Solomon Islands is one of the most active efforts to preserve and revive traditional navigation, including stick chart use and wave piloting. Under the guidance of navigator Lino Ueli and others, students learn how to build and interpret stick charts using traditional materials, how to detect wave signatures by lying on the deck of the tepuke traditional canoe, how to time swell intervals and map them to island locations, how to combine oral knowledge with sea practice. Many of these students have now completed inter-island voyages without GPS, relying entirely on stick chart training and wave reading. They are proving, in real time, that this is not nostalgia, it is living technology. Limits and strengths of swell navigation. Let's be honest, wave navigation is not easy, it has limits. It's most reliable in calm or moderate conditions. In stormy seas, swell readings become difficult to interpret. It requires long-term memory and trained perception. It is learned, not improvised. But its strengths are immense. It requires no instruments. It never runs out of batteries. It functions day and night, even when the sky is overcast. It enables long-distance travel across featureless ocean. And above all, it trains attentiveness. A navigator who feels the sea this deeply becomes attuned to far more than just navigation. The stick chart lives on. While few navigators today rely exclusively on stick charts or wave piloting, the knowledge is not lost. It's being translated, reinterpreted, revived. In schools across the Marshall Islands and beyond, elders now teach the mating again, helping young people understand that their ancestors weren't just survivors. They were engineers, scientists, and artists of motion. Some young navigators even use both old and new tools, GPS for safety, and stick charts for understanding. The ocean hasn't changed, the swells still whisper, The stick charts still describe them if you know how to look. What kind of maps do we trust? We tend to trust maps that look like the land satellite images, street grids, topographical elevations. But the stick chart asks something different. It says don't look, feel. It doesn't promise a destination. It teaches a way of perceiving. It doesn't guide your eyes. It trains your body. It doesn't record information. It creates memory. So the question is, when the stars are gone and the engine fails, will your hands still remember the rhythm of the sea? The canoe moves quietly now, not fast, not aimless. The navigator lies still, sensing the rhythm of intersecting swells. There is no chart in hand. It was left behind, hung on a wall, woven from sticks and shells. But the chart is still here, its shape imprinted in the navigator's mind, not as a picture, but as a feeling. The ocean doesn't forget, and neither do the people who have learned how to listen. In this final section, we conclude the story of stick charts not as artifacts, but as vessels of cultural survival. We'll explore how they carried knowledge through generations, how they shaped identity and trust, and how they continue to whisper across the Pacific, asking only one thing: that someone remember how to feel the waves. The map that disappears once learned. Unlike Western maps, which grow more useful the more often they are referenced, the stick chart's highest function is its own obsolescence. Once a navigator has internalized the knowledge, the routes, the wave behaviors, the currents, the physical chart is no longer needed. It becomes a memory tool, a teaching aid, and eventually, a relic. This is a radical concept, a map designed to vanish from use. In Western cartography, permanence is power, but in Micronesian navigation, impermanence is the goal. Mastery means letting go of the object and becoming the instrument. This turns the very idea of mapping inside out. The navigator doesn't look at the map, he is the map. Navigational knowledge as identity. For many Pacific Island societies, navigation isn't just a skill, it's a marker of identity. Who you trained under, what islands your ancestors voyaged between, which chance you learned to remember swell patterns, whether you've earned the right to build or read a chart. These things matter. A navigator's reputation was measured not by titles, but by success, landfall after long silence, safe arrival when others doubted, the ability to guide a canoe through invisible geography. And this identity carried with it responsibilities. To teach only when the student was ready. To honor the line of teachers who came before. To never speak of the sea with arrogance. The stick chart was never just a tool, it was a test. Could you learn enough to no longer need it? The erosion of tradition and its roots of resistance. As colonization spread across the Pacific in the 19th and 20th centuries, traditional navigation suffered. Western missionaries, administrators, and traders often dismissed stick charts and oral knowledge as superstition. European-style maps, compasses, and steamships became symbols of progress. In the Marshall Islands and elsewhere, younger generations were sent to mission schools. They learned to read and write, but not to feel the waves. Elders began to teach in secret, or not at all. By the mid-20th century, fewer and fewer young men knew how to build or read a stick chart. But the knowledge didn't vanish. It drifted, quietly preserved by a handful of navigators, whispered in nighttime chants, reenacted in children's games on the beach. When modern anthropologists began asking questions in the 1970s and 1980s, some elders were hesitant. Others shared, generously relieved someone was finally listening. And the quiet maps returned. From canoe to classroom, modern revival. In recent decades, stick charts have found their way into museums and classrooms not as artifacts, but as living lessons. In the Marshall Islands, schools now include cultural navigation in the curriculum. The College of the Marshall Islands offers workshops in stick chart building and interpretation. Navigators from Kiribati, Pohnpei, and the Solomon Islands are collaborating on revitalizing wave knowledge. The Vaka Tomako project teaches youth to build traditional tepuke canoes, read swells, and memorize stick chart patterns. This revival isn't about nostalgia, it's about reconnection. In a world where GPS signals dictate movement, stick charts offer something different: awareness, patience, and resilience. Children who build charts aren't just learning navigation. They're learning how to belong to an ocean that once connected their ancestors to each other across thousands of miles. Stick charts and climate memory. As sea levels rise and island nations face existential threats, navigational traditions offer a different kind of value: environmental memory. Navigators, trained to observe cloud patterns, sea color, and swell shifts, often notice ecological changes long before instruments do. This current is faster than it was when I was a child. The birds no longer fly this route. The reef has changed color, there is bleaching. These are not anecdotes. They are data held in the minds of those who have studied the ocean by body and by memory, year after year. Some climate researchers now seek collaboration with traditional navigators, recognizing that oral history may be the longest continuous environmental record we have. The stick chart may not show temperature rise, but it holds the conditions under which the ocean used to behave, and that's a map worth reading. Lessons for the modern mind. The stick chart teaches us more than how to find land. It asks questions that reach beyond the sea. What does it mean to learn something so deeply that you no longer need the object you learned it from? Can a system of knowledge survive only in memory and remain accurate? What kinds of attention are we no longer cultivating in our world of screens and signals? In a sense, the stick chart is not a navigational tool. It's a philosophy of learning. You don't need to travel by canoe to learn from it. You only need to learn to listen longer than is comfortable, to wait without rushing, to trust memory and train it, to learn something not for today, but for the day when there's no map left but the one inside your body. The final drift. The canoe nears land. The swell is changing. The reflection has grown stronger. You feel the beat of the waves shifting under your spine. There is no chart, but you know what the chart would have shown. You are sailing inside a memory, a pattern, a lineage. And you are exactly where you should be. You've reached the end of Story 4, Mats, Maps, and Memory, How Shell Charts Tracked Ocean Currents. Imagine Captain James Cook on the deck of the Endeavour, watching the ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The ship cuts through strange waters far from Britain's charts, yet it glides with growing certainty. Cook, already a seasoned navigator, realizes that his most valuable guide is not his sextant or almanac but a man standing barefoot beside him, calm and unreadable. His name is Tupia, and he has already been here. This is the forgotten story of the Polynesian navigator priest who joined Cook's first voyage, a man who understood thousands of miles of ocean as intimately as most knew their back gardens, a man who taught, corrected, and sometimes quietly overruled the British officers who thought they were discovering something new. This is not just Cook's voyage, it is Tupia's ocean. A boy of Raiatea, raised in the Temple of Stars. Long before he met Europeans, Tupia was raised in Raiatea, a sacred island in the Central Society Islands now part of modern-day French Polynesia. His early education did not take place in a schoolhouse. It took place in the Mari, a sacred stone temple complex where knowledge was passed orally and ritually. Tupia was born into a priestly lineage and was trained in the Arioi class, an elite society of artists, priests, and navigators. He was chosen to become a tahua, a priest and expert in Toromi knowledge of the universe, including the positioning of stars, seasonal weather patterns, the behavior of birds and fish, the language of swells and winds. This was no informal education. It required years of memorization, chanting, observation, and travel. Tupia learned not only how to navigate between islands, but how to think like the ocean. He would later become a high priest at Taputapuatia, the most sacred mare in eastern Polynesia. From here, voyaging canoes had once departed for Aotearoa, New Zealand, Hawaii, and the Marquesas. To Europeans, Raiatea was just another island. To Tupia, it was the center of a living sea network. The arrival of strangers, when Europe entered the Pacific. By the mid-1700s, European ships had begun appearing more frequently in Polynesian waters, first Dutch, then French, and finally, the British. Tupia was fluent in several Polynesian dialects and quickly picked up the speech of the newcomers. His training had prepared him to observe, compare, and adapt. He knew this encounter would change everything. In 1767, British Captain Samuel Wallis arrived at Tahiti aboard the HMS Dolphin. He met Tupia, who was already well respected across Tahiti and Raiatea, and noted his intelligence and poise. But it was not until 1769, when Captain James Cook arrived, that Tupia's fate would change. Cook had been dispatched on a scientific voyage to observe the transit of Venus, but his real orders were to explore the southern Pacific and claim any uncharted lands for the British Crown. What he didn't expect to find was a man who had already mapped the ocean he intended to claim. The encounter between two navigators. Cook was an accomplished seaman. He had charted Newfoundland with astonishing accuracy and was known for his precision and self-discipline. But in the Pacific, he was a beginner. Tupia, on the other hand, had likely voyaged between dozens of islands. He knew the archipelagos, the weather systems, the migratory birds, and the oral traditions of each place. When the Endeavour stopped at Tahiti, Joseph Banks, Cook's companion, and the expedition's chief naturalist took an immediate liking to Tupia. He saw in him not just a guide, but an intellectual equal. Tupia offered to join the voyage. Cook, skeptical at first, eventually agreed. He assumed Tupia would be useful for local translation, maybe help with supplies. He did not know that Tupia would soon become the primary pilot through the most complex ocean on Earth. The map in his mind. Tupia never drew maps on paper. But when British crew members began asking him about other islands, he described a vast network of landmasses and paths across the sea. His knowledge extended across more than 2,000 nautical miles from Hawaii to Rapa Nui, from Samoa to Aotearoa. When pressed, he dictated the names and directions of over 70 islands, most of them accurate in both position and relation to each other. He described sailing times, prevailing winds, and which islands were friendly or dangerous. Modern researchers have since compared Tupia's oral map with satellite data and found a high degree of accuracy. For someone without Western instruments, the feat was staggering. But to Tupia, it wasn't remarkable. He was merely repeating what he had memorized through years of training. The interpreter and the outsider. As the Endeavour moved westward, Tupia's value became impossible to ignore. He translated with Fijians, Tongans, and Samoans. He negotiated for food and water. He understood local customs and advised Cook on how not to offend chiefs. His status as a priest opened doors that the British could never have opened themselves. And yet among the crew, he remained an outsider. While Banks treated him with respect and curiosity, others on board were wary. Some dismissed him as superstitious. Others envied the authority he seemed to command among islanders. Cook himself acknowledged Tupia's usefulness but remained ambivalent. He recorded in his journals the many times Tupia's guidance proved correct, but he did not fully grasp the depth of his training or the system of knowledge that supported it. To Cook, navigation was a science. To Tupia, it was a relationship with the sea, The stars, the ancestors. The ghost navigator. Tupia's influence peaked as the Endeavour approached Aotearoa, New Zealand, in late 1769. The Maori, descended from Polynesian voyagers centuries earlier, initially approached the British ship with suspicion. But when Tupia spoke, they understood him not just linguistically, but culturally. He knew their customs, their ancestry, their spiritual practices. To them, Tupia was not a foreigner. He was Wanonga kin. This moment astonished the British crew. It proved that Polynesians had navigated vast distances long before Europeans even entered the Pacific. Tupia had just done what no map or translator could. He had made the Endeavour belong, if only briefly, to the Pacific. But this achievement would soon be forgotten. Illness, dismissal, and erasure. In 1770, the Endeavour reached Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, a Dutch port city rife with disease. Dozens of crew members fell ill. Among them was Tupia. He died of dysentery, along with his young servant Teata. When the ship returned to Britain, the records of the voyage cook's journals, Banks's notes, sketches focused on the scientific observations, the new charts, the discoveries. Tupia was mentioned, but not celebrated. His map of islands was filed away, unrecognized for its full brilliance. His role in mediating with indigenous peoples was minimized. His spiritual and navigational knowledge was largely ignored. He had helped them sail across an ocean, but he had not fit into their idea of what a navigator was. And so he became a ghost. The quiet legacy. In Polynesia, Tupia's memory never vanished. His name is still spoken among navigators, historians, and cultural revivalists. In Raiatea, elders teach children that Tupia stood between worlds. In Aotearoa, he is remembered as the first Polynesian to return by ship, tracing the path his ancestors took centuries earlier. In museums and universities, scholars now revisit his charts, reconstruct his oral maps, and recognize his contributions. What Cook once saw as native assistance is now understood as something much more. A moment when two vast knowledge systems met and one was overlooked. What makes a navigator? Cook had maps, Tupia had memory. Cook had instruments, Tupia had lineage. Cook was educated in charts. Tupia was educated in chants, the star paths, the swell lines, the names of islands not yet seen. In many ways, Tupia did not just accompany the Endeavour. He piloted it through waters his people had long known. But he died far from home, his role obscured in British history books. And yet, his map never needed to be on paper. It lived in those who listened. And maybe, like the stick charts of his cousins in Micronesia, it was never meant to last except as a memory in motion. The South Pacific fades into the mist behind the stern of the Endeavour. You can still hear the creaking of timbers, the quiet clatter of tools below deck, and the persistent ripple of sea against hull. But in your mind, there's something else, a series of island names recited in careful sequence, each linked to a star, a swell, a memory. These are not notes in a ship's log. They are the oral cartography of the Pacific. They are Tupia's maps. A world without paper maps. Tupia never studied trigonometry. He never drew coastlines with compass and ruler, but he knew how to describe an ocean with absolute clarity. When the British asked him about the islands he knew, Tupia didn't provide latitude and longitude. Instead, he named each one, gave the sailing time from the last, described the wind and swell patterns, and linked it to a directional star. This was not a lack of precision. It was another form of precision built from time, memory, and repetition. For every island, Tupia knew the star that guided travel to and from it, the number of nights it took to reach it under good weather, the landmarks on approach, its place in the ancestral stories of origin and migration. This formed a relational map, a network, not a grid. Polynesian star navigation, the cognitive map. Tupea's mental map was part of a broader Polynesian tradition of star navigation. It began at the Papa Mona, the sacred training grounds for navigators, where the sky and sea were read together. Navigators learned. Star compasses. The sky was divided into houses, or star lines, each linked to a directional bearing. Star rise and set. The precise azimuth of when a star rose or set on the horizon determined its usefulness for travel. Sequential memory. Navigators memorized long sequences of stars used during each leg of a voyage. The sky was not just beautiful, it was structured. As you sailed east, west, north, or south, different stars guided you. And when clouds obscured the sky, the navigator relied on swell angles, bird patterns, sea color, the known timing of island landfalls. This was not mystical. It was empirical, repeated, and deeply internalized. Tupea's chart for the British. One of the most remarkable moments of cultural exchange came when Tupea, prompted by Cook's crew, described over 70 islands he could navigate to from his home in Raiatea. British artist and draftsman Herman Spurring, part of the Endeavour's crew, attempted to create a Western-style map from Tupea's descriptions. The result, a circular diagram with island names written around the edge, was a translation of Polynesian relational mapping into British spatial cartography. To modern eyes, the chart is confusing. There is no scale, no fixed orientation, no coastlines. But recent scholarship has revealed something astonishing. When interpreted correctly using Polynesian methods, it accurately reflects the positions and relationships between islands over thousands of miles. The diagram is not a literal map. It's a mnemonic wheel, turning based on the orientation of the canoe, with directions given relative to the navigator's position. Tupea was not trying to copy British methods. He was offering something different, a floating map, always adjusted by the knowledge of the user. The British failure to understand. To Cook and his officers, Tupea was useful, but he was not seen as a peer. They praised his ability to mediate with islanders, to procure supplies, and to interpret local customs. But they consistently underplayed or misunderstood the depth of his navigational knowledge. Cook wrote, Tupea's knowledge of these islands is very extensive, and he had been to many of them. But Cook did not fully grasp that Tupea's knowledge was not simply the product of personal travel. It was the result of a system of cultural transmission spanning centuries. To appreciate this would have required the British to view Polynesian oral knowledge as intellectually equal to European science. That in the 18th century was a bridge too far. Instead, Tupea's chart was filed away. His methods were not studied. His navigational feats were recorded as curiosities, not insights. The encounter had happened, but its meaning was not understood. The voyage through hostile waters. As the Endeavour continued west, Tupea's presence remained critical. In Tonga and Fiji, his ability to communicate and interpret local norms helped the British avoid violent missteps. In New Zealand, he stunned the Maori with his understanding of their Wakapapa, the genealogical chants connecting tribes across time. He was not a stranger to them, he was an uncle returned. Still, tensions grew on the ship. Some officers resented the high regard in which Joseph Banks held Tupea. Others grew uncomfortable with his spiritual practices, his offerings, his invocations, his belief that ancestors still traveled with him. Tupea was navigating two worlds, the vast ocean he knew, and the narrow decks of a foreign ship that claimed dominion over it. It could not last forever. The tragedy at Batavia. In October 1770, the Endeavour limped into Batavia for repairs after suffering damage on the Great Barrier Reef. The city, dense, humid, and disease-ridden, was one of the deadliest ports in the East Indies. Dysentery and malaria spread quickly through the crew. Tupia, already weakened from months at sea and unfamiliar food, fell ill. So did his servant Teata. Neither survived the ordeal. Their deaths were recorded in the ship's logs with brief entries. Cook did not mention Tupia's passing in detail. Banks noted it with sorrow, but even his words faded as the voyage continued. Tupia had guided the ship across half the Pacific. But he died a world away from Raiatea, unnamed in most British maps, and largely uncredited in the histories that followed. A navigator's burial. We do not know where Tupia was buried. No grave remains. No monument was erected. But among navigators and cultural historians across the Pacific, his memory endures not as a tragic figure, but as a link between ancestral wisdom and the modern world. Tupia was not lost. He was absorbed into the very ocean he described so fluently. What happens to a map when the guide is gone? Tupia left no scrolls, no printed charts, no books. But he left something else. A record of names, remembered by those who listened. A chart interpreted decades later as astonishing in its accuracy. An example of cultural knowledge dismissed too easily, yet now increasingly recognized. In recent years, scholars like Anne Salmond, David Turnbull, and Lars Eckstein have revisited Tupia's legacy. They argue that had he lived, he might have been seen not just as Cook's interpreter but as a co-navigator of the endeavor itself. His story forces us to ask, what knowledge have we ignored because it didn't come in the form we expect? How many navigators on land or sea have gone unnamed because they spoke in stars instead of scripts? Tupia was charting more than an ocean. He was charting a conversation between cultures, between systems of knowing, between people who looked at the same sea and saw different truths. The canoe sails on. The British call it discovery. But Tupia knew this route had been traveled before. And it would be traveled again. The ship is long gone. The island of Batavia now pulses with the life of a modern port city, its colonial scars blurred by asphalt and noise. The logs of the Endeavour sit quiet in archives, but Tupia's story, though quiet, is not finished. Because he was never only one man. He was the living memory of an oceanic culture that stretched its fingers across the Pacific long before any compass was drawn, and far beyond the reach of European imagination. And though he died unnamed in the maps of his companions, the stars have never stopped calling his name. Tupia after death, a quiet erasure. After Tupia's death in late 1770, the Endeavour continued on its voyage, eventually returning to England. Cook's journals were studied, Banks's botanical drawings admired, and the voyage was lauded as a scientific triumph. But of Tupia, only brief mentions, a few sketches, one recorded chart. Despite his essential role as cultural interpreter, linguistic mediator, diplomatic guide, skilled navigator, Tupia was relegated in the British record to a kind of native assistant, an intelligent and helpful local, but not a central figure. This wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was the consequence of a worldview that saw knowledge as valid only when written, measured, and European. To elevate Tupia would have required the British to admit that their greatest discovery in the Pacific was not theirs. So he became a footnote, a ghost drifting just beyond the reach of official history. Modern rediscovery, scholars, navigators, and the map he carried. It took more than 2 centuries for scholars to revisit Tupia with the seriousness he deserved. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, historians like Dame Anne Salmond began to reassess Cook's voyages through Polynesian eyes. What they uncovered was astonishing. The islands Tupia described were not random guesses. They formed an intricate, coherent web that matched modern satellite maps. His interactions with Maori and other islanders demonstrated deep cultural fluency, not lucky coincidence. His role aboard the Endeavour, once considered peripheral, was increasingly seen as foundational. In particular, a single document commonly known as Tupia's chart became the focal point of renewed analysis. Originally misunderstood as a clumsy attempt to map the Pacific, it was later revealed to be something different: a Polynesian star path and relational navigation tool, encoded in ways that European cartographers had no framework to decode. When reinterpreted using principles of Polynesian wayfinding, the chart came alive. It was a mental model, a floating universe. It was genius. The deep ocean of memory, cultural resilience through navigation. Tupia's knowledge didn't die with him. It had been preserved across hundreds of years, within chants, rituals, and oral genealogies. Long after Europeans stopped sailing by the stars, Polynesians continued to remember quietly, carefully. In the 1970s, something extraordinary happened. On the island of Satawal in Micronesia, a man named Maupiailug, a traditional navigator trained in the old ways, guided a replica double-hulled canoe Hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional methods: stars, swells, birds, and cloud patterns. No compass, no GPS, no maps. Just memory, rhythm, and ancestral skill. The voyage was successful, and it changed everything. The Polynesian Voyaging Society was born. A generation of navigators relearned the knowledge their ancestors had carried. And Tupia, long forgotten in British museums, began to rise again, his legacy reclaimed not from dusty journals, but from living tradition. Tupia the teacher, what he still offers today. Tupia's story, reassembled from fragments, is not only about navigation, it's about what kinds of knowledge we value, who gets to be called an expert, how entire systems of science can exist outside Western frameworks. He was not a curious native. He was a scientist, a priest, and a diplomat operating within a system that had its own logic, rigor, and excellence. He didn't assist Cook. He piloted him through waters Cook barely understood, among peoples Cook could not speak to, across distances Cook couldn't imagine crossing alone. In a modern world obsessed with data, maps, and algorithmic precision, Tupia teaches us about relational knowledge, the kind that is passed body to body, voice to voice, memory to memory. He teaches us that knowledge does not need to be written to be real. That land can be located by listening to the sea. That a chart once memorized disappears because it now lives within you. The legacy of the ghost navigator. In some Maori oral histories, there are stories of a powerful visitor who came on a great ship and spoke their language. A man who knew their ancestors and the shape of the ocean. He came, and then he was gone. They do not call him Cook. They call him Tupia, the man who returned. This is perhaps the deepest truth of Tupia's legacy. He did not need Britain to record him in stone or ink. He was already inscribed in the sea itself. Final reflections: the stars still remember. So here now, as you lie listening, eyes closed, the pulse of waves beneath your awareness, imagine looking up at the Pacific sky. Each star you see once lit the path for someone like Tupia. Someone who knew which star marked the path to Samoa. Who could read the language of the sea just by placing a hand over the canoe's edge. Who understood that islands were not isolated specks, but nodes in a web of memory and meaning. Tupia's story didn't end in Batavia. It never belonged solely to Cook's voyage. It belongs to the ocean, to the chant, to those who still navigate not just with tools but with trust. The sea remembers him. And so should we. It begins with birdsong. A warble above the crashing surf, a flutter of feathers in tangled forest canopy, the high-pitched call of a petrel wheeling above limestone cliffs. The soundscape is lush, chaotic, and ancient. Now, imagine that same place with only the sound of wind and the brittle crack of dry palm leaves underfoot. You've arrived at Henderson Island, part of the Pitcairn Islands in the remote South Pacific, some 3,000 miles west of South America. It is one of the most isolated islands on Earth and once one of the richest in biodiversity. Today, it is better known for its silence. This is the story of an ecosystem lost not to war or empire or industry, but to human arrival itself. Not modern humans, but ancient seafarers, people whose names are forgotten, but whose footprints remain etched into the coral sands. It is a story of extinction, fragility, and the unintentional legacy of those who touched the edge of the world. The world's most isolated Eden. Henderson Island is small, about 14 square miles, and uninhabited today. Yet despite its size and remoteness, it was once an ecological jewel in the Pacific Crown. It was covered in dense forests of Pisonia, pandanus, and coconut palms. Its cliffs were carved by wind and sea, forming natural shelters and caves. It harbored 10 endemic plant species, found nowhere else on Earth. Its land and seas were alive with dozens of bird species, including the flightless Henderson crake, the Henderson lorikeet, and seabird colonies that turned the island white with guano. More astonishing still, it was once home to a human settlement, a Polynesian outpost so remote, it was nearly forgotten by history. This society lived here not for decades, but centuries. And then they disappeared. Arrival without ceremony, the first settlers. Around the year AD 1050, a group of East Polynesians arrived on Henderson Island, likely from Pitcairn or Mangareva, hundreds of miles to the west. These voyagers were expert canoe builders and navigators. They arrived in double-hulled vessels, possibly as part of an exploratory mission or a resettlement effort. Henderson, though small, was enticing. It had fresh water, though seasonal. It had fish, birds, fruit, and fertile soil. And crucially, it was uninhabited. These settlers brought with them the usual Polynesian cargo: chickens, rats, dogs, and plant crops. They cleared parts of the forest. They built ovens and shelters. They harvested birds, turtles, and fish. At first it worked. A community of perhaps 40-80 people lived and thrived on Henderson. They were part of a broader trade network with Pitcairn and Mangareva. From these larger islands, they obtained basalt tools, obsidian flakes, and other materials not native to Henderson's limestone geology. But then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, that world began to unravel. An island that could not bounce back. Henderson's ecological balance was fragile from the start. Its forest grew slowly in porous, nutrient-poor soil. Its birds evolved without predators. Its land was small and resources finite. Even modest human activity had outsized impacts. Flightless birds like the Henderson rail and various sandpipers were easy prey for hungry settlers and their dogs. Tree loss for fuel and canoes reduced habitat for nesting seabirds. The introduction of Polynesian rats triggered cascades of extinction by eating bird eggs and seedlings. Overharvesting of turtles and fish may have depleted vital seasonal protein. By the early 1400s, just a few centuries after arrival, the birds were declining. The soil was thinning. The trade routes likely disrupted by ecological stress on nearby Pitcairn and Mangareva collapsed. And with no access to outside resources, the people of Henderson were trapped. They could no longer build canoes large enough to leave. Within another century, the last human footsteps faded from the island. The forest tried to return. The birds did not. What the archaeology tells us. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to dig into Henderson's past literally. Excavations in the 1950s and 1980s revealed stone tools made of non-native materials, proof of external trade. earth ovens with fish bones, bird remains and turtle shells, burial sites with human bones and grave goods, carbon-dated layers showing bird extinctions coinciding with human presence. Of the 9 species of land birds present before human settlement, at least 6 went extinct shortly after. These included a flightless pigeon, a large flightless duck, at least 2 types of flightless rails. These birds were not just ecosystem players, they were keystone species. Their loss disrupted pollination, seed distribution, and the island's entire ecological fabric. Even seabird populations, once immense, declined. With trees cut and nesting sites destroyed, they vanished from most of the island interior. What was once a cacophony of wings and song had become quiet. The modern rediscovery and its irony. In 1606, Spanish explorer Pedro Fernández de Queiroz may have sighted Henderson, but it remained off charts for centuries. In 1819, British Captain Henderson gave the island its modern name after stumbling upon it while charting for trade. By then, it was long abandoned. Modern scientists returned in the 20th century, initially to study seabirds. They found an ecosystem still recovering but profoundly changed. Many endemic species had vanished forever. Others clung to survival. Ironically, Henderson's inaccessibility protected it from further colonization or development. It was too dry, too remote, too small for plantations or ports. In 1988, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, citing its ecological uniqueness. But by then, it was already hosting a new problem. Plastic. In the 21st century, currents of the South Pacific Gyre began depositing massive amounts of marine debris on Henderson's shores. In 2017, it was dubbed the most polluted island in the world by researchers, with up to 37 million pieces of plastic on its beaches despite being uninhabited. The birds were gone. Now the waves brought garbage in their place. Why this story matters? Henderson Island is not famous. It appears in few history books and fewer textbooks, but it tells a story echoed across the Pacific and the world. A story where small disruptions have outsized impacts. Trade and connectivity sustain communities, but also their collapse. Isolation, once a refuge, can become a trap. And most of all, ecological change can be invisible until it's irreversible. The settlers of Henderson did not intend to destroy it. They were simply living, planting, hunting, cooking, fishing. But the island was too fragile, the system too closed. When the birds stopped singing, it was already too late. What happens to a civilization with no way home? This is the unresolved question that haunts Henderson. The final generation of settlers cut off, surrounded by ocean, unable to build seaworthy vessels, must have realized they were the last. What did they think as the birds disappeared? As the fish grew scarce? As the chants of ancestors fell silent in the forest? They left no writing, no temples, no stele. Only bones. And the rustle of wind in trees that no longer host nests. Imagine waking every morning to the sight of endless blue on all sides. You live on a sliver of land barely 14 square miles surrounded by reefs and distant horizons. There is no passing trade, no sails on the horizon, no way to leave. This was Henderson Island in its final human days. After the trade routes collapsed, the people of Henderson were cut off from the outside world. No basalt arrived from Manuscript. No visitors brought news. No one came to take them home. What happens to a society when it becomes truly isolated? The anatomy of isolation. Henderson was never a permanent homeland. It was a satellite settlement, part of a larger triangle of occupation that included Pitcairn, Ono, and Manuscript. Each island in this triangle had something unique to offer. Manuscript had fresh water, arable land, and hard basalt for tools. Pitcairn had volcanic soils and forests for canoe building. Henderson had birds, turtles, shellfish, and palm nuts, but little else. These islands were interdependent. Trade and communication were their lifeblood. When Mangareva began to suffer ecological degradation from deforestation and population pressure, possibly due to its own collapse, the triangle broke. Henderson, farthest out, became an isolated outpost. The people left behind had no volcanic stone, no hardwoods for canoes, and no large-scale agriculture. Their tools dulled. Their ability to leave dwindled. The sea became not a highway but a barrier. They were stranded. The psychological weight of disappearance. What did the people of Henderson think as their world closed in? The archaeological record suggests their culture persisted for several generations after isolation. They continued to fish, gather, hunt birds, and maintain gardens. But over time, tools became cruder, made from shells and coral instead of imported basalt. Food options shrank. As turtles and birds declined, dependence on shellfish and plant roots increased. Social structures likely weakened. With no trade, no external validation, and dwindling resources, traditional leadership and religious structures may have eroded. There are no records of war or violent collapse on Henderson, no mass graves, just a gentle fatting, a society quietly receding into silence. There is a haunting dignity in this. Unlike other collapses marked by conflict, Henderson's end seems to have been slow, sorrowful, and accepted. Perhaps they held hope that help would come. Perhaps they knew it would not. One day, a child was born on Henderson who would grow old and never see another island. Extinction in slow motion. Ecological collapse is rarely sudden, it creeps. The settlers would have noticed fewer bird nests each year, fewer chicks, songs once familiar gone from the trees. They might have looked to the ocean for answers, but the fish were harder to catch. The turtles had been over-harvested. Coral bleaching may have begun even then. And as their ecosystem thinned, their own lives grew more precarious. Droughts would have been deadly. Failed crops catastrophic. Injuries without basalt tools or outside help possibly fatal. This is extinction in slow motion. Not just of animals, of language, stories, rituals, and names. A vanishing without a witness. By the time European ships passed near Henderson in the 17th and 18th centuries, no trace of Polynesian settlement was visible from shore. The forest had partially regrown. The birds, though diminished, had reclaimed some niches. To passing sailors, it was just another desolate Pacific island. There were no smoke plumes, no houses, no voices. Yet beneath the surface, stone tools and oven pits waited silent for discovery centuries later. This is what makes Henderson's collapse unique. It was a quiet extinction, unobserved and unrecorded by the outside world. Most collapses have a witness, a scribe, a chronicle, a final battle. Henderson had none. Just absence. Lessons in fragility. The story of Henderson Island resonates today not just because of its past, but because of its parallels. It was part of a global system, connected through trade and interdependence. It suffered from ecological strain, loss of biodiversity, and climate unpredictability. When its network collapsed, resilience failed and recovery was impossible. We often imagine collapse as violent or sudden, but Henderson shows another version, the slow erosion of options, the narrowing of survival paths, the vanishing of voices unnoticed. In this way, Henderson is less a cautionary tale than a mirror. It asks uncomfortable questions. What is the true cost of interdependence when one link breaks? How long can we survive once the systems we rely on falter? Can silence be louder than catastrophe? The echoes of a lost language. No one knows what language the Henderson settlers spoke. There are no inscriptions, no oral traditions survive. We only have clues. Words shared by Pitcairn and Mangyurvan dialects. The arrangement of tools and ovens, suggesting Polynesian customs. Burial style, reflecting known Eastern Polynesian rituals. But the exact intonations, the stories told under the stars, the chants sung during bird hunts, they are lost. Somewhere in a cave, there may still lie a carved symbol or painted rock, waiting to be uncovered. Until then, the birds do not speak it. Neither do we. Nature's attempt to reclaim the silence. After human departure, Henderson's ecosystem began a slow process of partial recovery. The Henderson crake, a flightless bird once thought extinct, survived, a rare example of resilience. Some endemic plants persisted, seabird colonies re-established in less disturbed areas. But the full diversity never returned. Gone were the flightless pigeon, at least one species of flightless duck, the large forest-dwelling sandpipers. Even today, despite conservation efforts, these species remain extinct. Nature does recover, but not completely. And not quickly. Unseen footsteps still present. Today, Henderson Island is a protected site. Scientists visit periodically. Conservationists monitor the impact of invasive species, especially rats, which remain a serious threat to nesting birds. In 2011, a major rat eradication effort was launched. It failed. In 2022, another was planned, with better technology and more funding. Why? Because without intervention, the island's remaining endemic species will vanish not from ancient voyagers, but from modern neglect. We are now the inheritors of Henderson's silence. We know what happened, we understand the fragility, and we have the tools to act. What we choose to do or not do will determine whether the island sings again. Do we still hear the warnings? Standing on Henderson's windswept cliffs, you hear little but the ocean. But the lesson is still echoing. Fragility masquerades as abundance. Collapse is not always noisy. Extinction is not always visible until it is irreversible. In that silence, a final question hangs in the salt air. If no one is there to hear the birds stop singing, does it mean we're safe? Or does it mean we're next? There is a particular kind of warning that comes too late, a ghost of a signal, a caution from the past that arrives not as a cry, but as an absence. Henderson Island is such a warning. It does not speak in prophecy. It does not crumble into fire or fall to sword or empire. It does not scream. It simply goes silent. And in that silence, it waits for someone to listen. From abandonment to discovery, the island in modern eyes. When 20th century scientists first stepped onto Henderson's shores, they were not expecting to find the remnants of a lost society. The island was supposed to be uninhabited, untouched, a control group in the grand experiment of Pacific ecology. But as researchers dug beneath the forest floor, they found fragments of obsidian, shell and bone tools, bird bones arranged in midden heaps, hearths filled with charcoal and ash. Layer by layer, they reconstructed the life of a forgotten people who had, for generations, lived, cooked, hunted, and buried their dead here. It wasn't just an island. It was a once thriving micro-civilization, now erased. The globalization of collapse. Why should a tiny, remote island matter in the age of satellites and smartphones? Because Henderson wasn't a standalone story. It was part of a global pattern, one that mirrors, in miniature, the challenges we face today. Resource depletion. Henderson's settlers consumed birds and turtles faster than they could recover. Today, humans do the same at planetary scale. Interdependence vulnerability. When Mangyurva collapsed, Henderson followed. Modern economies are even more interconnected. Ecological blindness. The settlers may not have realized they were destroying keystone species. Today, we still fail to see how many systems depend on fragile biodiversity. Isolation in crisis. Once the boats could no longer be built, escape became impossible. In our world, there is no second planet to sail toward. In many ways, we are all Henderson Islanders now reliant on interconnected systems, drawing from finite reserves, buffered only by the thin blue line of atmosphere and ocean. The scale is different. The trajectory is eerily familiar. Plastic, the new extinction layer. Today, the most visible marker of human impact on Henderson is no longer a stone tool or a dead bird. It is plastic. In 2017, marine biologists estimated that Henderson Island had the highest density of plastic waste anywhere in the world. Over 37 million pieces littered its beaches, weighing over 17 tons. Most of it came from elsewhere washed up by ocean currents from thousands of miles away. Fishing gear, toothbrushes, bottle caps, lighters, shoes. Items discarded in cities like Santiago, Tokyo, or Auckland now sit on a reef-fringed atoll that no human lives on. This irony is staggering. An island once depopulated by its remoteness is now inundated by global proximity. Once isolated, it is now a dump for the whole world's detritus. Once a symbol of ecological collapse through overuse, it is now a symbol of collapse through neglect. In both cases, the result is the same: silence. The birds that remain, survivors on the edge. Despite all odds, a few species remain on Henderson. The Henderson crake, a small, flightless bird, still scuttles through the underbrush. It exists nowhere else on Earth. The Henderson lorikeet, brilliantly colored and agile, feeds on nectar and flowers. Several petrel species continue to nest on the cliffs, though their numbers are threatened by rat predation. Each of these species is a living relic, a survivor. They exist because of inertia and accident, because humans left, because no hotel or airstrip was ever built, because no cargo ship makes regular stops. But their survival is not guaranteed. They live in a fragile balance, one disrupted not by war or extraction, but by plastic, rats, and inattention. And they are being lost quietly, incrementally. Conservation as archaeology of the present. Today, a small but passionate group of conservationists are working to preserve Henderson Island. Efforts include rat eradication programs, which have met with limited success, monitoring expeditions to track bird population and marine pollution, policy work to limit marine debris through international cooperation. But even these efforts face obstacles. The island's remoteness makes logistics expensive. Political will for an uninhabited island is low. Global marine plastic continues to increase. It is a cruel paradox. Henderson's isolation, once a survival mechanism, now makes it hard to save. But the alternative, letting it fade, means losing more than just birds. It means losing a mirror, a lesson, and perhaps a last warning. Reflections on the silence. What do we do with places like Henderson? Do we preserve them like museums, sealed and sterile? Do we try to restore what was lost, reintroduce species, remove plastics, replant forests? Or do we leave them be, as cautionary tales, natural memorials to what happens when systems break and no one hears the collapse? There is no perfect answer. But in the silence, there is a question. What if the birds were warning us not just of their own extinction, but of ours? What if their disappearance is not the end of their story, but the beginning of ours? The island that speaks through silence. You will not find Henderson Island in tourist brochures. No cruise ships stop there. It appears on few maps. And yet, it may be one of the most important places on Earth. Not because of what it has, but because of what it lacks. Voices, tools, Songs, footsteps. In that absence is a message. Henderson is not an empty island. It is a story, a monument not to human greatness, but to human fragility.